The first thing that woke me wasn't the sound. It was the way the ground seemed to hesitate beneath my lungs, like the desert itself had taken a breath and decided not to let it go. My name is Evan Calder. I was 38 that spring, and I'd driven my old Volkswagen Westfalia down into Big Bend because I needed silence that didn't belong to anyone else. I live outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, but that winter had followed me home in ways I couldn't shake. Work that blurred into nights, a marriage that ended without a single loud argument, just the quiet erosion of trust. I told myself the desert would flatten all that noise. Big spaces, honest heat, nothing hiding behind trees. Big Bend disabused me of that idea within hours. The campsite was primitive, the kind you earn by driving long miles on washboard roads that punish every loose bolt and make you question your commitment to solitude. The sun went down hard that night, not gradually, but like someone had flicked a switch. One moment, the Chisos Mountains were bruised purple against the sky. The next, they were gone. No cell signal, no nearby campers, just my Westie, a ring of stones where a fire had burned sometime before me, and a darkness so complete it felt textured. I remember telling myself, out loud, that this was exactly what I wanted. By midnight, the temperature had dropped sharply, the metal skin of the van ticking as it cooled. I lay on my back, listening to the small, familiar sounds of the Volkswagen settling, the faint creak of the pop-top canvas moving in the breeze. Coyotes yipped far off, their voices thin and almost playful. I'd heard them 1,000 times before. They didn't bother me. What bothered me was the silence between their calls. It wasn't empty. It was attentive. At 2:36 a.m., something touched the underside of the van. Not a bump, not a strike. A pressure, slow, deliberate, followed by a dragging scrape that moved from the rear axle toward the passenger side. The entire vehicle rocked gently, the way it does when someone shifts their weight climbing inside. I froze, breath caught halfway in, every sense narrowing to that sound. Metal against something rough, uneven, heavy enough to matter. My first instinct was denial. Raccoon, I thought. Javelina. Maybe a big stray dog. The mind reaches for normal like a life raft. I lay there, perfectly still, listening as the scraping continued, a patient, circling motion beneath the floorboards. Whatever it wasn't rushing. It was exploring. The smell came next. Not the sharp animal musk I expected, but something sour and old, like damp leather left too long in the sun. It seeped up through the cracks, through the vents, faint but undeniable. My stomach tightened. The desert has a clean smell at night. Dust, stone, cold air. This didn't belong. I slid my hand toward the flashlight clipped near my head, moving inch by inch so the mattress wouldn't creak. The scraping paused, then resumed closer to the driver's door. The van rocked again, just a little more this time, enough to set the hanging mug by the sink chiming softly against its hook. That tiny sound felt like a scream. I told myself not to panic. Panic wastes oxygen. Panic makes noise. I'd camped alone for years. I'd dealt with bears in Utah, drunk trespassers near Quartzsite, storms that flattened tents like paper. This was just another test, another story I'd tell later with a laugh that would sound convincing enough if I practiced it. Then something pressed upward. The floor flexed beneath my ribs, not enough to break, but enough to prove intent. Whatever was under there wasn't just passing by. It was testing the weight, learning. My heart began to hammer so hard I was sure it could be heard outside. I flicked the flashlight on despite myself, the sudden beam bouncing wildly as my hand shook. The interior of the Westie looked painfully normal. My boots by the door, the folded map on the counter, condensation beating on the windows. Safe things, familiar things, lies. Another scrape, longer now, accompanied by a wet sound like skin or fabric being pulled across stone. The van swayed side to side. I tasted copper and realized I'd bitten my tongue. I leaned forward and pressed my ear to the floor, against every instinct screaming at me not to get closer. The sound traveled through the metal directly into my skull. Breathing, not panting, not growling. Slow, measured breaths, each one followed by a faint dragging noise, as if the thing exhaled and moved at the same time. I whispered, "Hey," without meaning to. The breathing stopped. In that silence, my mind filled the space with memories I hadn't invited. My ex-wife standing in the doorway the night she left, waiting for me to say something real. My father teaching me how to change a tire on this same van years earlier, telling me machines respond to confidence. I realized with a cold clarity that I'd been ignoring my instincts my whole life, sanding down fear until it fit neatly into reason. Something knocked once from beneath the driver's seat. Not hard, not aggressive, a single deliberate tap. I scrambled upright, knocking my elbow into the cabinet, pain flaring bright and useless. The flashlight beam skittered across the windows. Outside was nothing but black. No eyes, no movement, just the desert holding its breath. The scraping began again, faster now, circling the van's perimeter. The rocking grew more pronounced, the suspension groaning in protest. I could feel it through the soles of my feet, a vibration that crawled up my spine. Whatever it was low to the ground, heavy, and wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I reached for the keys hanging by the door, every motion loud in my ears. The engine would be my escape. Light, noise, movement, things that belonged to me. My fingers closed around the metal just as something slammed into the side panel, hard enough to rattle the windows. I shouted then, a raw, wordless sound torn out of me by terror. The impact sent the van rocking violently. The smell intensified, thick and choking. I fumbled the keys, dropped them, cursed myself, found them again fingers. The scraping turned into a rapid, frenzied drag, back and forth beneath the chassis, as if the thing had decided time was running out. When I twisted the ignition, the engine coughed once. The sound outside changed immediately, a sharp intake of breath, too deep, too close. The van lurched as something shifted its weight directly under the engine block. I screamed at the dashboard, begging the old Volkswagen to wake up, to remember every mile we'd survived together. The engine caught on the second try, roaring to life in the dead of night. The headlights snapped on, washing the campsite in harsh white light, and whatever had been under the van released a sound that I still hear in my sleep, a low, wet groan that rose into something almost like disappointment. The pressure vanished. The rocking stopped. I slammed the van into gear, tires spinning on gravel as I tore forward, not daring to look in the mirrors, not daring to stop until the darkness thinned and the road widened and the desert finally, reluctantly, let me go. Even miles later, hands locked white around the wheel, I could still feel the phantom weight beneath the floor, the memory of something learning the shape of my fear. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. And I didn't leave Big Ben the next morning either, because part of me knew, with a certainty that made my chest ache, that whatever had found me in the dark hadn't finished teaching its lesson yet. I drove until the road curved enough that the campsite disappeared behind the hills. Then I slowed, not because I felt safe, but because the shaking in my legs had started to bleed into my hands. The headlights carved tunnels through the desert, revealing nothing but scrub, rock, and the occasional flash of reflective eyes far off the shoulder. Every shadow felt intentional now. Every dip in the road felt like a trap resetting itself. I pulled over at a wide turnout just before dawn, engine idling, too afraid to turn it off. The smell was still there, faint now but stubborn, clinging to the upholstery like it had soaked into the van's memory. I kept telling myself that animals get curious, that fear magnifies things, that exhaustion rewrites reality, but my body wasn't listening. My body knew what it had felt. Wait with purpose. When the sun finally crested the horizon, it didn't bring relief. It just made everything clearer. I stepped out slowly, knees stiff, the desert air sharp and cool against my face. The underside of the van was streaked with dust, and something darker smeared along the metal frame in long, uneven arcs. Not blood, at least I didn't think so, but not oil either. It smelled wrong up close, sour and metallic, like rust mixed with decay. I crouched there longer than I should have, tracing the marks with my eyes, replaying the night second by second. The dragging pattern wasn't random. It looped, circled, like whatever it was had been mapping the van's edges, learning where the weight shifted, where the ground clearance narrowed. A rational voice in my head suggested a large animal with mange, maybe injured, maybe desperate. Another voice, the quieter one I'd spent years ignoring, asked why it would breathe like that. I drove back into the park later that morning, convincing myself that daylight changed the rules. Big Bend was waking up, hikers unloading packs, a ranger truck rolling past, the ordinary choreography of people who believed the land was benign as long as you respected it. I parked near a visitor area and finally shut the engine off, the sudden silence ringing in my ears. A ranger named Luis listened patiently as I told him what happened. I edited myself without realizing it, left out the breathing, softened the knocking, framed it as concern rather than fear. He nodded, hands on his belt, eyes steady. Probably a bear or a mountain lion, he said. Unusual behavior, but not unheard of. Drought's been rough. I asked him if animals ever tried to get under vehicles. Sometimes, he said. Shade, smells, curiosity. Then, after a pause, best not to camp alone in primitive sites if you're not comfortable. Not comfortable. The phrase lodged in my chest like an insult. Comfort had nothing to do with it. I thanked him, walked away, and spent the rest of the day pretending I was fine, hiking short trails, eating mechanically, smiling at strangers. But every sound made me flinch. Every breeze felt like something moving just out of sight. By evening, I knew I wasn't leaving. That's the part that still confuses me when I look back on it. I could have driven straight out of the park, back to Flagstaff, back to walls and locks and explanations. Instead, I chose a developed campground that night. Other campers nearby, clear sightlines, rules posted on wooden boards. I told myself I needed proof, that I couldn't let fear rewrite a place I loved without understanding why. I parked between two RVs, their generators humming softly, a lullaby of human presence. As darkness fell, the desert cooled again, and with it came that familiar tightening in my gut. I cooked dinner I barely tasted and climbed into bed early, exhausted in a way that sleep doesn't fix. The night sounds returned, coyotes, wind, distant laughter from another site. Normal things. I almost relaxed. Almost. Sometime after midnight, the temperature dropped sharply. I woke shivering, pulling the blanket tighter, listening. The generators had gone quiet. The campground felt emptied out, like a theater after the lights go down. I lay there, eyes open, counting breaths, telling myself that fear feeds on repetition. That's when I heard it. A slow drag, not beneath me this time, but across the gravel outside. Deliberate. Unhurried. It moved from the edge of the campsite toward the van, each scrape followed by a pause, as if whatever made it was listening for a reaction. I didn't move. I didn't reach for the flashlight. I watched the shadows on the curtains shift as something passed between the moon and my windows. The smell followed, stronger now, unmistakable. My throat tightened, eyes watering. A shadow stopped beside the driver's door. The handle rattled once. Not hard, not frantic, just enough to test. Every muscle in my body locked. The rationalizations I'd leaned on collapsed under the weight of that simple, undeniable act. Animals don't check handles. Animals don't pause to listen. The handle rattled again, slower this time. I slid my hand under the pillow and closed my fingers around the tire iron I'd placed there earlier, the cold metal grounding me in a way nothing else could. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure it was audible outside. I wanted to scream, to run, to disappear into noise and light. Instead, I stayed silent, holding my breath as if I could make myself smaller from the inside. Something brushed the side of the van, a soft, almost affectionate touch that made my skin crawl. The breathing started again, right outside the window now. Close enough that I could hear the wet catch in it, the uneven rhythm. I stared at the thin line of light beneath the curtain, half expecting to see fingers curl into view. A voice whispered my name. Not clearly, not loudly, just enough to be plausible. I squeezed my eyes shut, pain blooming behind them. Stress does things to the mind, I told myself. Sleep deprivation, fear. But the voice came again, closer, testing different sounds, like someone trying on a word they'd only read. Evan. I broke. I slammed the horn, a blast of sound that shattered the night, Lights flashing, alarms from neighboring RVs screaming into life. Shouts erupted. Doors opened. The presence vanished so quickly it felt like it had been pulled away, the smell dissipating as if the air itself had exhaled. I bolted upright, gasping, tears streaking my face, the tire iron clattering to the floor. People ran past my windows, flashlights cutting wild arcs through the darkness. Someone knocked, asked if I was okay. I nodded, unable to speak. They never found anything. No tracks, no marks. Just my shaking hands and a story that grew less convincing the more I told it. I left Big Bend at first light. I still camp. I still drive that old Volkswagen, but I don't ignore my instincts anymore. I don't rationalize away the moments when the world feels wrong, when the silence presses too close, when something unseen takes an interest. Because some places don't want you gone, they want you remembered. I thought leaving Big Bend would be enough. I believed distance would sand down the edges of what happened there, turn it into something I could file away under bad night, strange coincidence. That's how I'd handled everything difficult in my life. Put miles between me and the problem, call it growth, call it survival. But fear doesn't respect geography. The first night after I got home to Flagstaff, I parked the Volkswagen in my driveway instead of the garage. I told myself it was because the garage was cluttered, because I was tired, because I didn't feel like dealing with it. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. I didn't want the van enclosed. I didn't want to trap anything inside with me. I slept inside the house, every light off, every window locked, and still I woke up at 2:36 a.m. on the dot. My heart was racing before I even opened my eyes. That same sense of pressure sat on my chest, like something heavy had leaned down just enough to remind me it could. For weeks afterward, sounds became enemies. The scrape of tree branches along the siding, the neighbor's trash bin rolling in the wind, even the low rumble of a truck passing at night made my muscles seize. I stopped camping. I told friends I was busy, that work had piled up, that I needed a break. No one questioned it. People are comfortable with explanations that don't require them to imagine anything abnormal. But I wasn't comfortable. I was unraveling quietly. I scrubbed the underside of the van obsessively, convinced that if I could erase every trace, every smear, I could reclaim it. The smell lingered no matter what cleaner I used, faint but persistent, like a memory that refused to fade. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit in the driver's seat, keys in my hand, engine off, listening, waiting. That's when the dreams started. In them, I wasn't inside the van. I was underneath it, my back pressed into the cold dirt, staring up at the undercarriage as it loomed above me. I could hear my own breathing, ragged, panicked, mirrored by another breath just inches away, perfectly calm. In the dream, I never saw what shared that space with me. I didn't need to. The terror came from knowing it was patient, that it understood waiting better than I ever could. I woke from those dreams with dirt under my fingernails. I tried therapy. I tried logic. I read everything I could about Big Bend, its wildlife, its folklore, the stories rangers never put in pamphlets, miners disappearing in the early 1900s, campers reporting voices in the desert that didn't echo quite right, tracks found near dry riverbeds that didn't match any known animal. Every rational explanation frayed at the edges when held up against what I'd heard say my name. What finally broke the stalemate was a package. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, no return address, just my name written in block letters that pressed too hard into the cardboard. Inside was a single object, a hubcap. Old. Scratched. Volkswagen. My hubcap. The one I'd lost somewhere on a dirt road in Big Bend years ago, long before that night. I remembered the moment vividly now, how I'd heard it clatter away into the brush and decided it wasn't worth the trouble of searching in the heat. Standing there in my kitchen, holding the cold metal, I understood something I'd been avoiding. Whatever had found me under the van hadn't been curious. It had recognized me. The desert doesn't forget the way people do. It doesn't draw clean lines between past and present. I'd left something of myself there years ago. Carelessness, maybe, or arrogance, or just a piece of attention I should have kept. and something in that vast, patient land had noticed. I drove the van out of town that night, not back to Big Bend, never back there. I headed north toward higher ground, cooler air, places where the trees crowd close enough to make the dark feel contained. I pulled into a small campground near the Utah border just before dawn, surrounded by other vehicles, other lives. I slept for a few hours, dreamless for the first time in months. When I woke, the smell was gone. I sold the Volkswagen a week later. I didn't tell the buyer everything, just enough to sound like nostalgia instead of fear. Watching it drive away felt like letting go of a friend and an enemy at the same time. I still miss it. I probably always will. I camp differently now. I don't chase isolation the way I used to. I listen more to the land, to my body, to that quiet internal voice that knows when something is off long before the mind catches up. I don't stay when the air feels wrong. I don't argue with unease. Because some nights, even now, when the world is very still and the clock creeps toward 2:36 a.m., I swear I can hear something dragging itself slowly across the edges of my memory, testing the weight of who I am, seeing if I've learned. And the lesson is this: the wilderness isn't cruel. It isn't kind. It is aware. And when it reaches out from beneath you, when it presses, scrapes, breathes in the dark, it's not always trying to take your life. Sometimes it's testing whether you're willing to keep it. The first thing that felt wrong wasn't the lights. It was the silence that came before them. I'm Aaron Caldwell. I was 36 that fall, living out of a sun-faded Volkswagen Vanagon that had more miles than sense and more memories than comfort. I'd driven it across states that smelled like pine sap and diesel, across deserts that hummed under heat like a live wire. I trusted that van, trusted the way the engine ticked when it cooled, trusted the way the steering wheel shuddered at exactly 62 miles an hour. I trusted it the way you trust something that saved you more than once. And that night, parked on the Marfa Flats just outside town, I trusted the quiet too much. I wasn't from Texas. I was a Pacific Northwest kid who'd grown up under rain-heavy skies, but I'd been chasing open land for years, the kind of space that forces your thoughts to spread out or break apart. Marfa had been a pin on my map for a long time. People talked about the lights like they were folklore you could photograph, mysterious glows on the horizon, drifting, dancing, disappearing. I told myself I wasn't there for that. I said I was there for the stars, for the stillness, for the feeling of being small and unobserved. I pulled the van off onto a flat stretch of scrub, far enough from the highway that the road noise softened into a distant sigh. The ground was chalky, pale, dust puffing under my boots. The air smelled metallic, like hot stone cooling too fast. Even before the sun went down, there was a pressure to the place, subtle but insistent, like the land was holding its breath and waiting for you to notice. I cooked a simple dinner: beans, tortillas, the last of my coffee reheated until it tasted like regret. As the sky deepened from orange to bruised purple, the temperature dropped sharply. Desert cold doesn't creep, it snaps. I pulled on a hoodie and sat on the bumper of the van, watching the stars come out one by one, sharp and overconfident. By 10, the world had gone unnervingly still. No insects, no wind. Even the distant highway went quiet, as if someone had turned down the volume on existence. I remember thinking how unnatural it felt, how silence that complete doesn't relax you. It presses against your ears until you start listening for things you can't name. I told myself I was just tired. Long drive. Too much caffeine. I climbed inside the van, slid the door shut, and lay back on the narrow bed. The upholstery smelled faintly of oil and old fabric softener. Familiar, safe. I stared at the ceiling, listening to my own breathing, to the faint tick of cooling metal. That's when the first doubt crept in. Not fear, not yet. Doubt. The silence didn't belong to the night. It felt staged, like a pause before something began. I checked my phone. No signal. 11:47 p.m. I sat up, suddenly restless, and reached for the keys. I don't know why. I didn't plan to leave. I just wanted to feel the weight of them in my hand, that small reassurance that I could go if I needed to. The metal was cold, heavier than it should have been. At 11:58, I noticed the glow. At first, it was so faint I thought it was my eyes adjusting, a trick of contrast against the dark horizon. A soft amber dot, low and distant, hovering where the land met the sky. I leaned forward, heart slowing as my brain reached for explanations. Car headlights, a ranch truck. Someone else camped farther out. Then it moved. Not like a vehicle, not bouncing, not cutting across terrain. It glided, smooth, intentional. The light brightened as it approached, splitting briefly into two, then merging again, as if depth itself was confused by it. I slid the van door open and stepped out, boots crunching softly on the gravel. The cold hit harder now, biting at my fingers. The light was closer than it should have been, closer than any road allowed, and the silence, it held. No engine noise, no wind disturbed by motion, just that glow, steady and unhurried, drifting toward me. I told myself this was why people came here, that I was lucky, that I was witnessing something rare and beautiful. Denial has a soothing voice when you let it speak first. The light stopped just beyond the reach of my headlights, as if it knew exactly where that boundary was. It hovered there, pulsing faintly, a living thing breathing in the dark. I flicked the headlights on, half expecting it to scatter like an animal caught in a beam. It didn't flinch. The air smelled different suddenly. Sharp, electric, like the moment before a storm that never comes. The hair on my arms stood up. I became acutely aware of my own body. The thud of my heart, the tightness in my throat, the way my feet felt rooted to the ground. Another light appeared to the left, then a third, farther back. They weren't symmetrical. They didn't move in unison. They behaved like separate thoughts circling the same idea. I whispered something, maybe hello, maybe my own name. The sound felt wrong as soon as it left my mouth, swallowed too quickly by the night. The lights pulsed in response. Not brighter, not dimmer. Just aware. Panic doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet, logical suggestion. You should be inside the van. I took a step back, then another. Gravel scraped loudly under my boot, the sound obscene in its volume. The nearest light drifted closer, slow enough to feel deliberate. It stopped again, exactly where I stopped, mirroring me. My chest tightened. My mind scrambled for data, for stories, for anything that would make this fit into a category I understood. Atmospheric phenomena, refraction, ball lightning, the Marfa lights, words stacked up like sandbags against a rising flood, and none of them held. The temperature dropped again, sharply enough that my breath fogged. The fog didn't disperse the way it should. It hung in front of me, illuminated faintly by the glow, each exhale lingering like a confession. Then, without warning, one of the lights shot straight up. No arc, no fade. One instant it was there. The next it was gone, vanishing into the stars as if pulled by an invisible thread. The remaining lights wavered, pulsing faster now, the rhythm irregular, agitated. Something inside me broke loose. I bolted for the van, fumbling with the door, fingers numb and clumsy. The smell of ozone intensified, sharp enough to sting my eyes. As I threw myself inside and slammed the door shut, the lights surged forward, stopping inches beyond the glass. Up close, the glow wasn't uniform. It churned, layers within layers, like light trying to remember how to be solid. The van's interior filled with a low vibration, not sound exactly, more like pressure, as if the air itself was being compressed. I crouched between the seats, hands over my ears, heart hammering so hard I was sure it would give me away. I didn't know to what, or to whom. The lights hovered, pressing against the windows without touching, and for the first time since I'd arrived on the flats, I understood something with terrible clarity. This place was not empty. It was waiting. And whatever had found me out there in the dark had no interest in being seen, only in being close. I stayed frozen on the floor of the van, counting my breaths because it was the only thing that felt under my control, and every number sounded wrong in my head, like I was miscounting on purpose, like if I reached the wrong one, something bad would notice. The vibration intensified, not louder, just denser, as if the night was pressing its forehead against the metal shell of my Volkswagen and listening for my thoughts. The dashboard lights flickered once, twice, then steadied, casting that familiar dull green glow that suddenly felt like a lie I'd told myself for years. That machines meant safety, that walls meant separation. The nearest light slid along the windshield, slow, curious, tracing the curve of the glass like a fingertip. Wherever it passed, the cold sharpened. I could feel it through the metal, through the floor, up into my bones. My breath came out in shallow bursts now, and every instinct screamed at me to start the engine, to run, to break the spell of stillness with noise and motion and exhaust fumes. But another part of me, quieter and far more terrified, warned me not to move at all. Predators notice movement. So do things that aren't supposed to exist. I squeezed my eyes shut, and in that darkness, memories surfaced without permission. Other campsites, other nights when fear had brushed past me and I'd laughed it off. A knock on the side of the van in Idaho that turned out to be a branch. Footsteps in Utah that belonged to a curious coyote. I'd trained myself to rationalize, to downshift panic into explanation. That skill had kept me sane. It had also brought me here, convincing me I could always understand what I was seeing if I just stayed calm long enough. Outside, the lights pulsed faster, erratic now, like a heartbeat that couldn't decide whether to race or stop. The vibration deepened until it felt like pressure behind my eyes. I pressed my palms to the floor and felt it there too, humming up through the chassis, through the tires, straight from the ground. That's when the smell changed again. Not ozone this time, but something older and heavier like scorched dust and cold iron. The radio crackled. I hadn't turned it on. A burst of static hissed through the speakers, sharp enough to make me flinch. I stared at the dash, at the dead dial glowing faintly, and then the static resolved into something almost like a voice. Almost. It wasn't words. It was cadence without language, a rhythm that suggested intent without meaning, rising and falling like someone trying to remember how speech worked. "No," I whispered, and the sound came out thin, fragile. I slapped the radio off. The silence rushed back in so fast it made my ears ring. The lights withdrew a few inches from the glass. Relief flickered through me, brief and dangerous. Then the van rocked. Not hard. Just enough to be unmistakable. The suspension creaked softly, a familiar sound twisted into something obscene by context. I scrambled up into the driver's seat, hands shaking so badly the keys rattled when I jammed them into the ignition. The headlights flared to life, washing the flats in harsh white, and for a split second, I thought the lights outside had vanished. They hadn't. They were closer now, surrounding the van in a loose, uneven ring, hovering at different heights, some level with the hood, others higher, like watchful eyes at varying elevations. The ground beneath them looked wrong, shadows bending inward, depth collapsing, as if perspective itself was being pulled toward the glow. I turned the key. The engine coughed once, then died. My stomach dropped. I tried again. Nothing but a dry click, the sound of a battery suddenly too tired to care. The vibration outside intensified, and the lights brightened in response, feeding off my rising panic. The radio crackled again, louder this time, the almost voice pushing against the silence. Insistent. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel, a raw animal sound tearing out of my throat. "Leave me alone." The words echoed inside the van and went nowhere else. One of the lights drifted lower, close enough that its glow spilled across the hood in rippling patterns. The metal began to tick as if heating unevenly, though the air was freezing. My skin crawled, 1,000 tiny alarms firing at once. I realized then that the fear wasn't just for myself. It was for the van, for the thin barrier I'd trusted with my life, for the idea that I could always leave. A sharp knock struck the side panel. I flinched so hard my vision blurred. The knock came again, deliberate, metal on metal, followed by a faint reverberation that didn't fade the way sound should. It lingered, stretching, warping, as if the echo had nowhere to go. "Don't open it," I told myself aloud. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "Don't engage. Don't invite." Another knock. Higher this time. Near the window. I pressed my back against the seat, heart pounding, and that's when I noticed the temperature inside the van had dropped below the temperature outside. My breath fogged thicker now, curling in the green dashlight. Frost crept along the edges of the glass in delicate, impossible patterns, blooming outward in seconds. The radio burst to life again. This time it wasn't cadence, it was mimicry. My own voice crackled through the speaker, distorted but unmistakable, repeating the last thing I'd said. Don't open it. The phrase looped, overlapping itself, degrading with each repetition until it dissolved into static. Something inside me snapped cleanly then. Not panic, not reason, but resolve born from exhaustion. I couldn't outthink this. I couldn't understand it. But I could still choose. I threw the van into neutral, pumped the gas out of habit, and twisted the key one more time with everything I had. The engine roared to life like it had been waiting for permission, the sudden noise shattering the unnatural quiet. The lights recoiled as one, their glow stuttering, the ring breaking apart. I didn't hesitate. I slammed it into drive and floored it. The tires spun, kicking up dust and gravel, the van fishtailing as I tore across the flats toward the distant smear of highway lights. In the rearview mirror, the glowing orbs surged after me, keeping pace without effort, rising and falling as if riding waves I couldn't see. The vibration followed, a relentless pressure that made my teeth chatter. The radio screamed, pure static now, no voice, no pattern. The headlights flickered, dimmed, then steadied. I kept my foot down, engine screaming, every bolt and panel vibrating in protest. The world narrowed to the strip of ground ahead of me and the terror clawing up my spine. Just as the highway loomed into view, one of the lights shot upward again, vanishing into the sky. Another followed, then another. The pressure eased abruptly, like a hand releasing my skull. The vibration cut out mid-pulse, throwing me forward against the belt. By the time my tires hit asphalt, the flats behind me were dark, empty, silent in the ordinary, indifferent way of night. I didn't stop driving until Marfa's streetlights wrapped around me, until human sounds, doors closing, distant music, a truck idling, reclaimed the air. I pulled into a gas station and sat there shaking, engine running, staring at my reflection in the windshield like I was checking to see if I was still real. I slept in the van that night, parked under a sodium lamp that hummed reassuringly. Every sound made me flinch. Every shadow felt too intentional. When dawn finally came, it didn't bring relief so much as exposure. The desert in daylight looked harmless again, scrub and sky and endless space pretending it had never noticed me. I left Marfa that morning without saying goodbye to the flats. I drove until the land changed, until hills broke the horizon and the air softened. But something stayed with me, a quiet recalibration of instinct. I'd always believed fear was a problem to solve, a puzzle to dismantle with logic. Out there at 11:58 p.m., I learned a harder lesson. Some places don't want to be understood. They want to be respected. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do while RV camping in the wide, open American night is listen to the part of yourself that says leave, even when you don't know why, especially when you don't know why. Because not every light on the horizon belongs to a town, and not every silence is empty. I thought leaving Marfa would end it. I really believed distance would thin the memory until it became just another story I told myself to stay humble on the road. That's what RV life does to you. It convinces you that motion is the same thing as escape. But fear doesn't care about mileage. Fear only cares about access. I drove east that morning until the desert loosened its grip and scrub gave way to low grass and fence lines. I stopped twice without realizing why, hands trembling when I tried to pour coffee, heart jumping at nothing. The van ran fine, better than fine, like it was proud of surviving. That should have comforted me. Instead, it felt like complicity. Like we'd both seen something we weren't supposed to and agreed not to talk about it. By the time I crossed into the next state, I started noticing the silence again. Not the physical kind, but the internal one. The space where confidence used to live. Every night after that, no matter where I parked, I kept the headlights aimed outward longer than necessary, scanning tree lines, hills, empty shoulders. I avoided wide-open flats. I hugged truck stops and campgrounds with families and generators and barking dogs. Noise became a shield. Still, the lights followed me in smaller ways. Not literally, nothing that dramatic. It was subtler than that, which made it worse. A glow reflected in the windshield that vanished when I turned my head. A flicker on the horizon that matched the cadence of my heartbeat a little too closely. Once, in New Mexico weeks later, I woke up convinced the van was vibrating again, that same deep pressure in my skull, only to realize it was just my pulse pounding in my ears. That's when denial finally ran out. I stopped pretending it hadn't changed me. I stopped telling myself I'd overreacted. Whatever those lights were, natural, unnatural, misunderstood, or something without a category, they'd stripped something away. The casual certainty that the world plays by rules I can learn if I pay attention long enough. The assumption that being careful is the same as being safe. I started reading more, not about Marfa specifically, but about places like it. Liminal spaces, geographic oddities, regions where people consistently report the same sensations across decades. Pressure, disorientation, silence that feels intentional. The patterns were there if you didn't cherry pick. Not proof, not explanations, just repetition. And repetition is what fear uses to teach. I also started changing how I camped. I stopped arriving at new places after dark. I learned the difference between solitude and isolation. I listened harder to weather shifts, to animal behavior, to the tone of my own thoughts when something felt off for no clear reason. I trusted that feeling even when it cost me a perfect spot or a good night's sleep. Especially then, because what haunted me most about Marfa wasn't the lights themselves. It was how calmly they behaved, how patient. They didn't chase me at first. They didn't threaten. They observed. They waited until I acknowledged them, until I crossed an invisible line just by staying. That's a lesson the road doesn't teach you gently. Months later, I found myself camped near a Forest Service road in northern Arizona, pines creaking softly in the wind, the night alive with normal sounds, owls, insects, distant trucks. I should have felt safe. Instead, I felt alert in a new way, grounded, present. The difference mattered. Around midnight, I noticed a faint glow between the trees, not approaching, not hovering, just there. It could have been anything. A camper's lantern, a distant house, headlights filtering through branches. My old self would have investigated, curiosity dressed up as courage. I stayed put. I watched. I listened. I waited. After a few minutes, the glow disappeared, and with it the tightness in my chest. No escalation, no revelation, just a choice made early enough to matter. That night, for the first time since Texas, I slept through until morning. I don't tell this story because I think the Marfa lights are evil or alien or supernatural in the way people like to package fear into something shareable. I tell it because out there on the long American roads, in the places where towns thin out and the land stretches wider than your certainty, you are not the loudest thing in the dark. And pretending otherwise is how people get hurt. RV camping teaches you freedom, yes, but it also teaches you humility if you let it. The humility to know that not every mystery wants your attention. That not every unanswered question is an invitation. That some environments don't announce their boundaries with signs or fences or warnings you can Google ahead of time. Sometimes the warning is a silence that feels wrong. Sometimes it's a light that stops just beyond your headlights and waits to see what you'll do next. I still travel. I still love the road. I still park under stars so bright they make you feel like the sky is watching back. But I move differently now. I listen differently. I respect the night the way you respect a deep, deep body of water. Not because you think it hates you, but because it doesn't need to care about you at all. And when I think back to 11:58 p.m. on the Marfa Flats, I don't replay the panic anymore. I replay the moment before, the moment when everything went quiet and the land seemed to hold its breath. That was the real warning, because out there in the vast, beautiful, indifferent spaces we love to camp in, the most dangerous thing isn't fear. It's staying when every instinct tells you the lights you're seeing weren't sent to guide you home. The first knock didn't scare me. It confused me, which in hindsight was far worse. I remember thinking it sounded polite, almost careful, like someone tapping to make sure I was awake before saying something they didn't want overheard. I was lying on my back inside my old Volkswagen Westphalia, staring at the dim amber glow of the overhead light, listening to the wind slide through Palo Duro Canyon like a low, tired breath. My name is Caleb Monroe. I was 37 that fall, and I'd been RV camping alone long enough to trust the wrong things: routine, solitude, and my own stubborn logic. I grew up in Amarillo. Palo Duro was my backyard growing up, the place teachers took us on field trips and teenagers took each other to drink cheap beer and feel big. By 2018, I'd circled the country twice in that VW, learned which engines whined before they failed, which campgrounds went silent for reasons that had nothing to do with curfews. I told myself this canyon was familiar ground, safe ground, the kind of place where fear didn't belong. That's what I told myself when the knock came again. 3 taps, hollow, measured, not metal on metal like debris in the wind, not the sharp skitter of an animal claw. It came from low on the driver's side beneath the bed, where the exterior storage bay ran the length of the van like a rib cage. I held my breath and waited for the echo to explain itself. Nothing did. The canyon at night has a way of swallowing sound. Wind enters the rock and comes back altered, like it's been thinking. I lay there, listening to my own heartbeat fill the space between knocks, telling myself it was temperature shift, pressure change, the kind of nonsense you believe when believing anything else would mean sitting up and admitting you might be wrong. I didn't sit up. I didn't move. I stayed still long enough to hear the third knock arrive late, softer, like whoever or whatever was on the other side had leaned back and reconsidered. That's when unease crept in. Not fear. Unease. The quiet kind that doesn't shout. The kind that asks questions without words. I rolled onto my side and pressed my ear closer to the van wall. The smell of dust and cold canvas hung in the air, mixed with that faint, oily scent old Volkswagens never lose. Outside, the canyon was darker than it had any right to be. No moon, no campground chatter, just the sense of space pressing inward. I told myself animals don't knock. Then I told myself they scratch. The thought sat there, unwanted but heavy, and before I could push it away, something dragged slowly across the storage bay door. Not a scrape, not a scuttle, a deliberate pull like a fingertip testing the surface. My mouth went dry. My first instinct was denial, not of danger but of my own reaction. I'd promised myself years ago I wouldn't let old fears dictate new moments. I'd lost someone once because I ignored my instincts, then blamed myself for trusting them too late. Since then, I'd swung the other way, overcorrected, rationalized everything, laughed off dread until it learned how to whisper instead. So I told myself I was tired. Canyon acoustics. A raccoon with ambition. I reached for my flashlight. The beam cut through the van in a narrow cone, catching dust motes that looked like movement until they weren't. I slid open the side window an inch, just enough to listen. Cold air spilled in, sharp and mineral heavy. Somewhere far below, something cried out. A long, wavering sound that might have been a coyote, except it broke in the middle like it had almost formed a word. The knock came again, louder this time, closer, from directly beneath me. I sat up. That was the moment tension turned into suspicion, because the sound didn't travel through the van the way outside noises usually do. It didn't echo, it resonated, like it was already inside the shell with me, testing boundaries. I swung my legs down, my bare feet touching the cold floor, and felt the van shift slightly under my weight. The knock stopped. I waited, counting seconds in my head, listening to the tick of cooling metal. Nothing. I should have stayed put. I know that now. But curiosity and fear are siblings, and I've never been good at telling them apart. I cracked the door and stepped out into the night. Palo Duro Canyon smelled different after midnight. The daytime dust gave way to something damp, ancient. The rock walls loomed without definition, like the dark had erased their edges. My campsite sat at the end of a spur road, no immediate neighbors, just enough distance to feel private when I arrived. Now it felt exposed. I crouched beside the storage bay, flashlight shaking just enough to irritate me. The metal door was closed, locked. I ran my hand over it, feeling for dents, warmth, anything that would explain the sound. That's when I saw the marks. Fresh scratches, thin and shallow, clustered near the latch like something had tested it repeatedly. They weren't random. They curved, overlapping in a pattern that suggested intent rather than panic. I pressed my thumb against one and felt the burr where metal had been lifted. Animals don't do that, my mind said automatically. I unlocked the bay. The hinge creaked louder than it should have, the sound snapping back off the canyon walls. I froze, half expecting the knock to answer from somewhere else, but the night stayed still. Inside the compartment there was nothing out of place. Folding chairs, toolkit, a spare hose coiled just the way I always left it. No animal, no debris, no explanation, except the inside of the door. More scratches, deeper this time, and one long smear that looked less like a claw mark and more like something had dragged itself sideways along the metal, testing the give. A wave of dread rolled through me, cold and uninvited. I shut the bay harder than necessary and backed away, scanning the darkness beyond the beam of my flashlight. The canyon didn't give anything back. No movement, no sound, just the feeling of being observed from multiple distances at once. That's when panic began to stir. Not the explosive kind, but the kind that tightens your chest and makes every option feel wrong. Get back inside the van and lock the door, or stay out here where at least I could see? The decision was made for me. A knock sounded from the opposite side of the van. I spun, heart slamming, lights swinging wildly. The sound came again, higher this time, near the rear storage panel. Same rhythm, same measured patience. It wasn't moving fast, it was relocating. My thoughts fractured. Multiple possibilities raced through my head, each worse than the last. A person playing a game, someone testing to see if I was alone, something else using the van like an instrument. "Hey," I called out, my voice thinner than I wanted. "Camp's closed, you need to move on." The words fell into the canyon and didn't come back. The knock answered instead, one single tap from the original bay. I backed into the van, slammed the door, and threw the lock. My hands shook as I killed the lights, plunging myself into darkness so complete it felt like pressure on my eyes. I lay down without removing my boots, every nerve lit, listening. The knocks resumed. Not frantic, not aggressive, patient. As if whatever was outside understood that time was on its side and mine was already running out. I lay there in the dark, boots still on, spine pressed against the thin mattress, listening to the van breathe the way it always did when the temperature dropped too fast. Metal ticking. Canvas tightening. Sounds I'd trusted for years suddenly felt like accomplices. The knocking didn't come right away, and that pause was worse than the noise itself. It felt deliberate, like whatever was outside wanted me to sit with my imagination long enough to do the work for it. When the knock returned, it came from directly beneath my head. Not loud, not sharp. A dull, careful pressure, as if someone were testing how much force it took to be noticed without causing alarm. I squeezed my eyes shut and focused on my breathing, telling myself not to move, not to give it feedback. Predators, human or animal, react to reaction. That's what I'd always believed. The knock slid sideways. I felt it travel along the length of the storage bay, a sequence now instead of a single point. Thump, pause, thump, each one spaced evenly, tracing the underside of the van like fingers counting ribs. The sensation wasn't just auditory. It vibrated up through the frame, into the mattress springs, into my jaw. My teeth clicked once before I realized I'd clenched them too hard. I reached for my phone, then stopped. No signal down here. I already knew that. I'd checked when I arrived, annoyed at myself for forgetting how deep the canyon swallowed everything. Calling for help would mean stepping back outside, and the thought of opening that door again made my stomach turn. Another knock. This one harder. Insistent. Denial gave way to suspicion, and suspicion turned inward. I started questioning my own memory. Had I locked the bay earlier? Had I seen those scratches before and dismissed them? The mind will betray you under pressure. Rewrite history to make the present survivable. I felt that happening, the edges of certainty softening. Something brushed against the canvas near my shoulder. I flinched so hard the van rocked. The sound wasn't a knock this time. It was a drag, slow and uneven, like fabric being tested by something unfamiliar with it. I held my breath, listening to the faint rasp as it moved upward, then stopped. My skin prickled, every hair standing on end, as if my body had decided to react before my thoughts could catch up. A smell crept in. At first, I thought it was engine oil, that familiar, comforting stink of machinery. Then it shifted, sweeter, rot-adjacent, like damp leaves left too long in a sealed bag. It didn't belong to the canyon or the van. It felt imported. That's when dread settled fully into my chest. I whispered no, not to anything specific, just to the situation itself, as if refusal might still carry weight. I slid my hand toward the small hatchet I kept under the seat, the one I'd never actually needed before. My fingers wrapped around the handle, slick with sweat. The knock came again, higher now, near the rear window. Then, unmistakably, something scraped along the latch of the storage bay from the inside. I froze. My thoughts collapsed into a single impossible image, something already within the shell of the van, moving between compartments, learning the structure faster than I could. The rational part of me screamed that it made no sense. The older, quieter part, the one shaped by past mistakes, knew sense had nothing to do with it anymore. A new sound joined the chorus. Breathing, shallow, controlled, close enough that I could feel it more than hear it. A subtle pressure change against the canvas wall. It paused when I paused, resumed when my breath stuttered. The realization hit me like ice water. Whatever was out there was listening to me listen. Panic surged, hot and electric. I bolted upright and slammed my shoulder into the van wall without meaning to. The response was immediate. 3 rapid knocks, hard enough to rattle the storage door. The patience was gone now. The tone had shifted. I shouted, my voice cracking, "Get away from my vehicle." Silence answered. Absolute, the kind that feels staged. I waited for the canyon to return to itself, for the wind or the distant howl of something normal to fill the gap. Nothing came. The smell lingered, thicker now, clinging to the air inside the van like a held breath. Then came the sound that finally broke me. A knock from inside the storage bay. Not outside metal being struck, not vibration through the frame. A hollow thud, contained, resonant, like something knocking outward from a confined space. The directionality was wrong. The physics didn't work. I scrambled backward, hitting the cabinets, heart trying to escape my chest. The hatchet felt useless, absurdly small against the reality pressing in. The knock repeated, closer to the latch, followed by a scraping sound that mirrored the scratches I'd seen earlier, but now it was happening in real time. I made a decision born entirely of fear. I turned the ignition. The engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life, the sound exploding into the canyon like a flare. Headlights cut through the darkness, flooding the campsite with harsh white light. For a split second, relief washed over me. Noise, movement, control. Something ran. I saw it only in fragments, a shape peeling away from the side of the van, too low to be a person standing upright, too fluid to be an animal I recognized. It moved on all fours and then not, limbs rearranging as it crossed the beam, disappearing into the scrub with a speed that felt wrong for its size. I didn't wait. I threw the van into gear and tore down the spur road, gravel spitting, tires screaming in protest. My hands shook so badly I had to grip the wheel with my forearms just to keep straight. In the rearview mirror, the canyon swallowed my campsite whole, darkness closing over it like nothing had ever happened. I didn't stop until I hit the main road and the horizon began to pale with the promise of morning. I spent the rest of the night parked under harsh fluorescent lights at a closed gas station miles away, engine off, doors locked, watching every reflection in the glass. When the sun finally rose, I drove home without stopping, the smell still clinging to my clothes, the sound of that inward knock replaying every time my thoughts slowed. In the days that followed, I went over everything again and again, trying to extract a lesson that would make it manageable. Stay in populated sites. Trust your instincts earlier. Don't camp alone. All true. All insufficient. What I learned instead was quieter, harder to swallow. Some places remember us more clearly than we remember them. Some environments don't just surround you. They engage, test, respond. That canyon didn't chase me. It didn't need to. It pressed and waited and let my own denial carry me most of the way. I sold the Westphalia the following spring. I still camp. I still believe in the road. But every time I hear a knock in the wrong place at the wrong hour, I don't argue with it anymore. I leave. Because whatever was knocking that night didn't want inside. It already was. Thought leaving would end it. That distance would thin the memory the way miles thin mountains into lines. But fear doesn't obey geography. It waits. It follows quietly, like dust carried in the seams of your clothes, showing up later when the light hits just right. For weeks after Palo Duro, I slept in fragments, 90 minutes at a time, sometimes less. I'd wake to phantom sounds, the soft compression of a mattress shifting, the suggestion of pressure against a wall. Knocks that weren't there but felt real enough to jolt me upright, heart hammering, lungs burning as if I'd been underwater too long. I stopped turning the lights off at night. Darkness had lost its neutrality. People asked why I sold the van. I gave them mechanical reasons: age, maintenance, mileage. All of it true in the way excuses are true when they're built to carry something heavier underneath. What I didn't tell them was that I couldn't open the storage bays anymore without my hands shaking, that every latch sounded like a challenge, that I'd started checking inside compartments before checking the mirrors. The mind does strange things when it can't resolve an experience. It tries to file it under categories it understands. Animal, person, prank. I tried each one, turning them over late at night, testing their weight. Animals don't knock from inside. People don't move like that. And pranks don't leave marks that still show up in your dreams years later, fresh as the day you saw them. I went back once, not to the campsite, never that, but to Palo Duro during daylight, telling myself I needed closure, that returning on my own terms would shrink the memory down to scale. The canyon looked harmless under the sun, red rock glowing, tourists laughing, kids running ahead of parents who trusted the world enough to let them. I stood at a railing and looked down into the shadows that never quite burn off, even at noon. The air still smelled the same. Dry, old, patient. That's when I understood something that had been circling me since that night. The fear wasn't about what I saw. It was about how long it waited. Whatever had been at my van didn't rush. It didn't panic when I didn't respond the way I was supposed to. It adjusted. It learned. It listened. That kind of behavior leaves a mark deeper than violence ever could, because it forces you to question the one thing you rely on when everything else fails, your ability to read a situation accurately. I'd always believed experience made you safer, smarter, more prepared. But standing there, sunlight on my face, I realized experience can also make you predictable. It teaches you patterns, and patterns can be used against you. I started changing how I camped after that. Not just where, but how I thought. I stopped treating silence as peace. I stopped assuming isolation meant safety. I paid attention to the first moment something felt off, instead of waiting for evidence strong enough to justify leaving. Evidence comes late. Instinct doesn't. There's a lie we tell ourselves as campers, especially those of us who love the romance of the road and the idea of self-reliance. We say fear is weakness, that courage is staying put, that riding it out proves something. That lie almost cost me more than a van. Courage isn't staying when your gut tells you to go. Courage is accepting that you don't need a story to justify leaving. You don't need to see the thing clearly for it to be real. You don't need to win. You just need to survive intact enough to keep trusting yourself. Even now, years later, there are moments, small ones, that pull me back. A knock from the wrong direction. a sound that repeats with too much intention, the smell of damp metal in cold air. When that happens, my body reacts before my thoughts do. I don't argue with it anymore. I don't stand still waiting for confirmation. I move. Some nights when sleep won't come, I think about that storage bay, about the scratches I saw before I understood what they meant, about how close I was to dismissing them completely. I think about how many people do exactly that every year in places like Palo Duro, how many convince themselves that familiarity equals safety, that beauty cancels out danger. The wilderness doesn't work that way. It doesn't care how experienced you are. It doesn't care how many miles you've logged or how confident you sound when you tell yourself everything's fine. It responds to presence, to opportunity, to hesitation, and sometimes it answers back. If there's a lesson in what happened to me, it isn't about monsters or mysteries or even fear. It's about listening to the quiet shift in your chest, to the moment the air changes, to the knock that doesn't belong. The world gives warnings long before it gives explanations. I learned that at 12:22 a.m. in Palo Duro Canyon, lying in the dark inside a van I thought I knew, while something on the other side of the wall demonstrated patience I didn't have. I still love camping. I still believe in the road, but I don't romanticize it anymore. I respect it. And respect, I've learned, sometimes sounds like an engine starting in the middle of the night and gravel spraying as you leave without looking back. Because the most dangerous thing you can do out there isn't being afraid. It's convincing yourself you shouldn't be. The first scream didn't sound human, but it didn't sound like an animal either. And that was the problem. It sliced through the desert air so cleanly that it woke me from a half dream, the kind where you don't know if your eyes are open yet, but your body already knows something is wrong. The sound didn't come from one direction. It didn't echo the way noise should in open land. It moved, gliding across the basin, leaping from ridge to ridge like it knew where I was parked and wanted me to know it too. My name is Evan Calder, and at the time I was 38 years old, born and raised in Arizona, someone who grew up believing silence was safety. I'd been RV camping for almost 15 years by then. Deserts, forests, badlands, places most people only see through postcards or warnings. I trusted my experience more than my instincts, and that was my mistake. That July, I'd driven my old Volkswagen camper, sun-faded yellow, engine rattling like loose bones, down to Terlingua Ghost Town, just outside Big Bend National Park in Texas. I wanted isolation. I told myself I needed it. My marriage had ended quietly a year earlier. No yelling, no cheating, just a slow erosion of trust until nothing was left but politeness. I'd learned that when life gets loud, I escape into places where nothing speaks back. Terlingua had always felt like a place that understood that impulse. Abandoned mercury mines, rusted ruins, a desert that swallowed sound during the day and returned it warped at night. I parked on the edge of a dry wash, far enough from the ghost town lights that the dark felt complete, but close enough that I could still see the silhouettes of crumbling structures against the stars. The first night passed without incident. Wind through creosote bushes, the faint smell of dust and old metal, coyotes yipping far off, their calls thin and sharp, familiar enough that I slept through most of it. The second night was when the desert decided to speak differently. I'd gone to bed early. The heat still clung to the camper walls, turning the interior into a stale oven, even with the windows cracked. Sweat pooled at my collarbone. Every time I shifted, the vinyl seat stuck to my skin. Somewhere after midnight, the air cooled suddenly, like someone had opened a door you didn't know was there. That's when the scream, long, warped, rising and falling in pitch like a voice being stretched. It carried pain, but not panic, not fear. Something closer to calling. I sat straight up, heart hammering. My first thought, embarrassingly simple, someone's hurt. My second thought followed just as quickly, no one should be out there. I checked my phone. No signal. The time read 3:09 a.m. The scream came again, closer this time, or at least it felt closer. The sound scraped against the aluminum skin of the camper, vibrating faintly through the walls. It wasn't loud in a normal sense. It was invasive, like it had bypassed my ears and gone straight for the inside of my chest. I told myself it was an animal. Foxes scream. Mountain lions scream. People forget that. I'd heard recordings. I'd even heard something similar once in Utah years earlier and laughed it off in the morning. But this was different. Animals scream from somewhere. This sound refused to stay put. I slipped on my boots, hands shaking just enough to make the laces feel foreign. The smell inside the camper had changed. Metallic, sharp, like overheated wiring. I told myself it was my imagination. Stress. The desert messes with you like that. Temperature shifts, silence so deep your brain fills it with noise. The scream rolled again, this time breaking at the end like whoever or whatever was making it had turned their head mid-cry. I cracked the door. The night hit me all at once. Cold, clean, too still. The stars were violent in their brightness, scattered so thickly it made the sky feel low. The desert stretched out in every direction, pale and empty, moonlight turning the rocks into bone, and then the sound moved again. It passed from left to right, sweeping across the valley floor in a slow arc as if circling the camper. I felt it in my teeth, in the soles of my feet. The scream wasn't echoing off the hills, it was choosing them. "Hello?" I called, the word thin and useless. The sound stopped. Silence rushed in so fast it made my ears ring. I stood there longer than I should have, scanning the ridges, the wash, the scattered mesquite shadows that now looked like crouched figures. Nothing moved. No footsteps, no reply, just the desert holding its breath. That's when I noticed the smell. It wasn't there before, a sour, organic stink drifting on the cold air. Not rot exactly, something sharper. Musky, alive. It reminded me of wet fur left too long in the sun. I backed into the camper and locked the door, feeling stupid for doing it and worse for needing to. I lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, counting my breaths, telling myself I'd overreacted. At 3:70 a.m., the scream came back. Closer. This time, it sounded directed. It rose from the wash behind the camper, so near that I could hear texture in it. Breaks, wetness, a rhythm that suggested lungs pushing air, not a throat tearing itself open. The sound slid along the ground, then climbed, cresting the ridge to my right before fading. My rational mind clung desperately to explanations. Animals patrol territory. Sound carries strangely in desert air. Lack of sleep distorts perception, but my body didn't believe any of it. My pulse hammered so hard I felt dizzy. Sweat soaked my shirt despite the cold. Every nerve felt tuned too tight, like a wire about to snap. I realized then that I wasn't afraid of being attacked. I was afraid of being found. Another scream followed, overlapping the first, as if two voices were answering each other from opposite sides of the valley. One higher, one lower. They didn't synchronize. They didn't clash, they conversed. I pressed my forehead against the window, breath fogging the glass. The darkness outside felt thicker now, less like absence and more like mass. I imagined shapes just beyond the reach of the camper lights, crouched low, listening. That's when I heard something new. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching softly over gravel. They stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, heart thundering, waiting for a knock that never came. Instead, a scream rose directly above me, so close it rattled the cabinets, so intimate it felt like it was happening inside my skull. The sound dragged on, fractured, then cut off abruptly, as if someone had covered a mouth. In the sudden quiet, a thought surfaced that terrified me more than the noise itself. What if it stops because it knows I'm awake? I didn't sleep after that. I sat rigid on the edge of the bed until dawn bled pale gray into the desert, listening for any sign of movement, any return of that impossible sound. Nothing came. By morning, the valley looked harmless again. Empty. Still. The smell was gone. No footprints, no disturbed gravel, no evidence of anything beyond my own unraveling nerves. I told myself I'd imagined it. I told myself a lot of things, but I didn't leave. Not yet. And that decision, that stubborn refusal to trust the quiet voice inside me that whispered go, is what nearly cost me my life the following night. By the second sunset, the desert had convinced me it had done nothing wrong. That's the danger of daylight. It edits the truth. Under the sun, Terlingua looked honest again. Bleached hills, heat shimmer rising off the Kalashi, rusted ruins sitting dumb and harmless against the sky. I walked the perimeter of my campsite that afternoon, boots crunching over gravel, proving to myself that there were no tracks, no signs of disturbance, nothing to justify the fear that still clung to my ribs. I stayed because leaving felt like admitting weakness. I stayed because part of me needed to believe that experience mattered more than instinct. I stayed because the scream hadn't hurt me. That logic sounds laughable now. By nightfall, the temperature dropped fast, the heat bleeding out of the rocks like a slow exhale. I cooked dinner without appetite, the smell of canned stew mixing with dust and old oil. Somewhere far off, a lone coyote called once, then went quiet. No chorus followed. That absence felt deliberate. I sat outside longer than I should have, watching the sky bruise purple, then black. The stars came out sharp and overcrowded, pressing down on the land. The silence thickened until every small sound, my breath, the ticking engine, felt intrusive. I checked my watch more than once. Midnight, then 1, then 2. At 3:41 a.m., the desert screamed again. This time, there was no ambiguity. The sound erupted from the south ridge, tearing through the stillness with such force I flinched hard enough to spill my coffee. It wasn't stretched or distant now. It was raw, close. Human-shaped in a way that made my stomach drop. It sounded like a woman, not yelling, not calling for help, just screaming, long, ragged, stripped of language, as if words had been burned out of her. My hands shook as I set the mug down. I waited for the sound to move the way it had the night before. It didn't. Instead, another scream answered it from the opposite ridge. Then another. 3 voices now, staggered, overlapping, passing the sound back and forth across the valley like a signal. The effect was dizzying. I couldn't tell where to look. Every direction felt wrong. The smell returned, stronger this time. That musky, sour tang slid into the camper through the open window, coating the back of my throat. It carried warmth with it, like breath. I slammed the window shut and locked it, my chest tight. My mind raced through explanations faster than I could hold on to them. Coyotes don't scream like that. People don't wander this desert at night without lights. Sound doesn't coordinate. And then I heard something that froze the thoughts clean out of my head. My name. Evan. It was faint. Almost swallowed by the wind. But it was unmistakable. No accent. No distortion. Just my name, spoken gently, from somewhere beyond the reach of the headlights. Every hair on my body stood on end. I didn't respond. I couldn't. The voice sounded too familiar, and that terrified me more than if it had been strange. I pressed myself against the door, peering through the narrow window. The headlights cut 2 pale tunnels into the dark, illuminating dust motes drifting like ash. Beyond that, nothing. Evan, the voice came again, closer now, as if whoever spoke had taken a few careful steps forward. My mind betrayed me then, offering images it shouldn't have. My ex-wife's voice when she whispered my name at night, soft and tired. My mother calling me in from the yard when I was a boy. The sound tugged at memory, not fear, and that's how I knew it was wrong. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. I still don't know why I did that. Maybe some part of me needed proof that the desert was empty. Maybe the voice had hooked something deeper than logic. Maybe I was already compromised. The air hit me like ice water. The smell was overwhelming now, thick enough to taste. I swept the flashlight beam across the wash, the rocks, the low scrub. Shadows jumped and collapsed. Nothing solid took shape. Then the screaming stopped. All at once, the silence was absolute. I took a step forward, boots crunching loudly, obscenely loud in the stillness. The beam caught something pale on the ground about 30 yards out. Fabric, maybe. I walked toward it without thinking, my legs moving on autopilot, my pulse roaring in my ears. It was a shirt. White. Torn. Stiff with dried dirt and something darker I didn't want to name. A cold realization slid into place then, heavy and undeniable. The screams weren't moving anymore because they didn't need to. They were converging. Footsteps crunched behind me. I spun around, flashlight swinging wildly, heart slamming against my ribs. The beam caught movement on the ridge. Figures, just silhouettes at first, standing too still, too upright. One, then another, then more, spreading out, forming a loose arc. They didn't approach. They watched. A scream tore out again, this one so close it felt like it clawed at my back. I staggered, panic finally breaking through whatever spell I'd been under. I ran, gravel slipping under my boots, lungs burning, flashlight bouncing uselessly. Behind me, the screams rose in unison, not chasing, guiding. The realization hit me as I burst back into the camper and slammed the door shut. They weren't hurting me away. They were directing me somewhere else. I locked everything, threw myself into the driver's seat, hands slick with sweat as I fumbled the keys. The engine coughed once, then died. Outside, the silhouettes shifted, spreading wider, blocking the open land. The voice returned, closer than ever, right outside the windshield. "Evan, you can come out now." It sounded patient. I screamed back, pure panic, no words, and turned the key again. The engine roared to life, headlights flaring. The figures vanished instantly, dissolving into darkness like smoke. I didn't hesitate. I slammed the camper into gear and drove blind, tires kicking up dust, following the only visible track away from the wash. The screams followed, pacing me, sliding across the ridges, never quite fading. They stopped only when the first hint of dawn crept over the horizon. I drove until my hands cramped, until the ghost town lights appeared ahead, dull and merciful. When I finally stopped, shaking too hard to move, the desert lay quiet behind me, innocent once more. In the daylight, I told a ranger what happened. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You heard the screaming," he said. "Not a question." I asked him what it was. He didn't answer right away. "People go missing out there," he said finally. "Sometimes we find clothes, sometimes we don't." That night, I left Terlingua for good, but the desert didn't leave me. Because even now, years later, in quiet rooms far from Texas, I still wake up at 3 or 9 a.m., heart racing, certain I hear my name carried on the wind, spoken by something that learned it under the stars. I didn't stop driving until the sun was fully up and the desert had lost its teeth. Even then, I didn't feel safe. Safety felt like a concept that belonged to other people, people who hadn't heard their own name spoken by the dark. I pulled over at a gas station just past Study Butte, hands still trembling as I shut off the engine. The sudden silence inside the camper rang louder than the screams ever had. I sat there for a long time, forehead pressed to the steering wheel, breathing in the stale smell of oil and dust, trying to convince my body that it was over. It wasn't. The ranger's words replayed in my head, looping without mercy. People go missing out there. After sunrise, I did something I'd never done before on a trip like that. I didn't head for another campground. I didn't push deeper into the wild. I drove straight into town and checked into the cheapest motel I could find, peeling paint, flickering sign, air conditioner that rattled like it might tear itself apart. I needed walls that didn't breathe. Sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the pacing of those screams, the way they slid across the land with intention. I kept seeing the silhouettes, upright, patient, waiting for me to make the wrong choice. By late afternoon, exhaustion dragged me out of the room. I wandered into a diner attached to the motel, drawn by the smell of coffee and grease. The place was nearly empty. A few locals sat scattered across the booths, sunburned and quiet, eyes that looked like they'd seen too much sky. I didn't plan to talk about what happened. I told myself I'd eat, rest, and leave Texas behind me by nightfall. But the desert has a way of reopening doors you're trying to keep shut. An older man sat at the counter, back hunched, hands wrapped around a chipped mug. He wore a faded Terlingua shirt, the kind sold to tourists who think ghost towns are quaint. He glanced at me once, then again, eyes narrowing just slightly. "You hear it last night," he said. "Not a question." The fork slipped from my hand and clattered against the plate. Every instinct told me to deny it, to laugh it off, to walk away. Instead, I nodded. The man took a slow sip of his coffee, as if I'd confirmed something he already knew. "You were camped south of town," he said, "near the wash." My mouth felt dry. "How do you know that?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, careful, because that's where it's loudest. I slid into the stool beside him, heart thudding. "What is it?" I asked. The man stared straight ahead. "Depends who you ask." I waited. Silence stretched between us, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, he spoke again. "Some folks say it's animals. Some say it's people messing around trying to scare campers." He shook his head slowly. "But the ones who've lived here long enough, we don't say that. What do you say?" I pressed. He turned then, meeting my eyes fully. There was no drama in his expression, just weariness. "We say the desert remembers." The words landed heavier than they should have. He told me stories then, not like campfire tales, not exaggerated or theatrical, just fragments. Hikers who followed voices and were never seen again. Campers who walked out into the night and left their gear behind, neatly packed, like they'd planned to return. Search parties that heard screaming from opposite directions at once, voices calling their names, leading them in circles until the sun came up. "They don't hunt you," he said quietly. "They wait for you to give yourself up." I thought about the moment I'd stepped outside, flashlight in hand, chasing a sound that had already crossed every boundary it needed to. I thought about how close I'd come to walking farther into that wash. "Why the screaming?" I asked. The man's jaw tightened. "Because pain is universal," he said, "and because we answer it without thinking." I left the diner with my appetite gone and my sense of reality cracked wide open. By evening, I was back on the road, the Volkswagen humming beneath me, the land flattening as miles slipped by. I kept my eyes on the horizon, refusing to let them drift toward the empty spaces on either side of the highway. I told myself I'd escaped. But the desert isn't confined to geography. That night, I stopped at a rest area miles away from Terlingua, surrounded by other vehicles, bright lights buzzing overhead. I should have felt safe. I should have slept. Instead, at 3:09 a.m., I woke to the sound of screaming. Not outside. Inside my head. It rose the same way it had before, long, sliding, moving from place to place without traveling. I sat bolt upright, heart racing, sweat cold on my skin. The rest area was silent. No one else stirred. No sound but the hum of distant traffic. Then I heard it. Evan. My name, whispered just behind my ear. I spun around, breath hitching, but the camper was empty. The voice faded, leaving behind a pressure in my skull, like a hand had pressed there and then withdrawn. I didn't stop driving after that. I crossed state lines before dawn, then another, chasing distance like it might erase what had happened. Years have passed since then. I sold the Volkswagen. I don't camp in the desert anymore. I don't camp at all, not really. Forests feel safer, but even there I sleep lightly, ears tuned for sounds that don't belong. I've learned something since Terlingua, something I wish I'd understood earlier. Fear doesn't always come to harm you. Sometimes it comes to test whether you'll listen. The desert didn't chase me. It didn't attack. It offered an invitation, wrapped in familiarity, delivered in a voice that knew exactly how to get my attention. The real danger wasn't the screaming. It was my willingness to answer it. Because there are places in this country, wide, empty, patient places, that don't need to reach for you. They only need you to take one step too far on your own. And if you do, they will remember your name. Years later, somewhere far from Terlingua, I used to believe leaving a place meant escaping it. That belief didn't survive Terlingua. For a long time after that night, I tried to pretend nothing had followed me. I rebuilt routines. I took work that kept me busy. I slept in towns with streetlights and neighbors close enough that silence never fully settled. On the surface, life resumed its shape. But at night, always at night, the desert came back. Not in dreams. Dreams end when you wake up. This was different. This was memory behaving like a living thing, rearranging itself, growing sharper with time instead of duller. At first, it was just the hour, 3:09 a.m. My eyes would snap open seconds before the clock changed. My body braced for a sound that never came. Then it started bleeding into my waking hours. I'd be driving through open country, windows down, and catch a smell that didn't belong. Hot dust, old metal, something faintly animal. My chest would tighten before my mind caught up. Once, standing in a grocery store aisle, I heard my name spoken softly from somewhere behind me. I turned so fast I nearly collided with a stranger. No one was there. I told myself it was trauma, stress, the brain replaying patterns it didn't know how to let go of. That explanation worked until it didn't. Until the night I found something that proved Terlingua hadn't let go of me either. It happened 3 years later in New Mexico, of all places. I was passing through on business, staying in a roadside motel not unlike the one I'd hidden in after fleeing Texas. Same flickering lights, same stale air, different desert. I woke at 3:09 a.m. again, heart pounding, skin cold, but this time there was no screaming. Instead, there was knocking. Soft, slow, 3 taps against the motel room door. I lay frozen, listening. The hallway outside was silent. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint hum of the vending machine at the far end. 3 more taps. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I knew better now. After a minute, the knocking stopped. I waited another hour before I dared to breathe normally. When dawn finally crept in, I opened the door. Something lay on the ground in front of it. A white shirt. Torn. Stiff with dirt. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. I already knew what it meant. That was the moment the truth finished assembling itself in my mind, clicking into place with sickening clarity. The desert hadn't been testing my courage or my curiosity. It had been measuring my availability. I went back to Terlingua once after that. Not to camp. Not to confront anything. I needed closure, or at least something that resembled it. I went during the day, under a sun so bright it felt aggressive. I stood at the edge of the wash where I'd parked the camper years before. The land looked unchanged, indifferent. It always does. I spoke to another local, an older woman this time, sun-leathered skin, eyes sharp as broken glass. I didn't tell her my story. I didn't need to. When I asked about the screaming, her mouth tightened in recognition. "People think ghosts are dead," she said. "That's their first mistake." I asked her what she meant. "Some things don't die," she replied. "They linger. They echo, especially in places where people vanish without being seen." She told me something then that I'd never heard before. Search teams, she said, sometimes find remains years later in places that had already been searched. Same ground, same coordinates, as if the land had held on to them and decided eventually to let them go. But most don't come back at all, she added. They don't get lost, they get kept. I asked her why some people hear the screaming and others don't. She studied me for a long moment. "Because some people listen," she said, "and some people don't." That was the answer I'd been avoiding since the beginning. The desert didn't single me out because I was unlucky. It noticed me because I was vulnerable. I came there carrying silence, grief, unfinished things. I wanted to disappear without dying. I wanted to be alone without being lonely. Places like Terlingua recognize that hunger. They don't need to chase you. They don't need to drag you screaming into the dark. They offer sound instead, familiar, human-shaped sound, and wait for you to step toward it. One step, then another, until the distance back becomes larger than the distance forward. That's how people go missing. Not all at once, not violently, but willingly. I left Texas that day for the last time. I haven't returned since. I don't camp in deserts anymore. I don't park near washes. I don't follow voices, no matter how urgent or familiar they sound. And when I speak about this now, when I tell this story, it isn't to scare you away from the land. The desert isn't evil. It's honest in a way most places aren't. It strips you down. It listens back. What you need to understand, what I learned too late, is that fear is sometimes a boundary, not an obstacle. When your body tells you something doesn't belong, it isn't being dramatic. It's remembering older rules written before maps and engines and cell towers. Out there, silence is never empty, and sound is never accidental. If you ever find yourself parked beneath a sky too wide to measure, and the night begins to speak in a voice that feels personal, your name, your memories, your grief, Don't answer it. Don't investigate. Don't try to be brave. Get in your vehicle. Lock the doors. Leave, because some screams don't mean someone needs help. Some screams are the land asking if you're ready to disappear. And once you answer, the desert will remember you forever. The first thing that unsettled me wasn't the darkness, it was the silence that felt arranged. Like something had carefully removed every sound that was supposed to be there. My name is Evan Mercer. I was 38 that winter, living out of a faded white Volkswagen RV I'd rebuilt with my own hands after a divorce that left me craving distance more than comfort. I'd grown up in East Texas, knew these forests the way some people know their own backyards, and that familiarity was exactly why I trusted the place more than I should have. Sam Houston National Forest wasn't exotic, it wasn't mythic. It was familiar ground. Pine needles, damp soil, long dirt roads that stretched like slow thoughts. I'd camped there dozens of times before. That night, I arrived later than planned. Work ran long, and by the time my headlights cut through the trees, the dashboard clock glowed 9:47 p.m. in a tired orange. February cold pressed against the windshield, not sharp, just heavy enough to make everything feel slower. The GPS showed what I expected: 3 other RVs already parked at the site, clustered near the tree line. A small sense of relief settled in my chest. I wasn't alone out there. Not really. But when I turned off the forest road and rolled into the campground, the relief drained out of me so fast it made my hands go numb on the steering wheel. The site was empty. No rigs, no tents, no lanterns swinging from awnings, just mud, soft, churned mud where tires had clearly been not long ago. Fresh tracks, deep and deliberate, but they didn't lead anywhere. They just stopped. Like the RVs had driven straight into the ground and vanished. I killed the engine and sat there, listening. The usual sounds were missing. No insects clicking, no distant traffic hum. Even the wind felt muted, as if the trees were holding their breath. The smell hit me next. Wet earth mixed with something sour, almost metallic, like rusted iron left too long in the rain. I told myself it was nothing. GPS glitches. People leave early. Forests change fast. I'd spent years rationalizing things through marriage, through its collapse, through the quiet loneliness that followed. Rationalization was a skill I'd perfected. It had kept me functional, if not happy. I stepped out of the RV, boots sinking slightly into the mud, and the cold seeped through the soles faster than it should have. My breath fogged in front of me, but the fog didn't drift. It hung there, low and stubborn. I walked to where one of the GPS-marked RVs should have been. There was a clear impression of a vehicle's weight, the outline of tires, even a faint rectangle where a leveling block had pressed into the soil, but no tracks leading out, just a clean, abrupt end. That was when the forest made its first move. A sound, not loud, not sudden, but wrong. It came from somewhere behind me, deep among the pines, a low, rhythmic knock, 3 beats, then silence, then 3 again, not sharp enough to be a hammer, not hollow enough to be woodpeckers. It sounded deliberate, patient. I froze, every instinct screaming to get back inside the RV, but another voice, older, stubborn, argued back. You know this place. Don't embarrass yourself over shadows. That voice had gotten me through worse nights than this. I trusted it more than fear. I called out, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. Hello? Anyone out there? The knock stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, like the forest was leaning closer to listen. My skin prickled under my jacket, not from cold, but from the sense of being evaluated. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the tree line. The beam of my flashlight caught on trunks slick with moisture, branches twisted into shapes that looked almost intentional when the light hit them just right. Every shadow felt like it lingered half a second too long. I went back to the RV and locked the door. The click of the deadbolt sounded too loud, like a confession. Inside, the familiar smell of old upholstery and motor oil grounded me a little. I brewed coffee I didn't want, just to hear the hiss and bubble of something normal. The sound filled the space, but it didn't push the silence away. It just sat inside it. I checked the GPS again, still showed 3 other RVs, still showed them close. I zoomed in, out, recalibrated. Nothing changed. My phone signal flickered between 1 bar and none, like it couldn't decide whether I existed enough to matter. That was when I noticed the temperature drop. Not gradual, not the slow creep of night cold. It fell all at once, like someone had opened a door somewhere unseen. My fingers stiffened around the mug. The windows fogged instantly, and when I wiped one clear, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. Footprints. Not human. Too narrow. Too many joints. They circled the RV at a distance, pressed deep into the mud, then stopped, just like the tire tracks. No entry, no exit. The knocking returned, closer this time. Same rhythm, 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. But now, layered beneath it, was something else. A sound that tried and failed to be a voice. It wasn't words. It was the shape of words. A rise and fall that mimicked speech without committing to it, like someone repeating a language they didn't understand, just close enough to fool you if you wanted to be fooled. I sat there, heart hammering, fighting the urge to convince myself it was a prank, or wildlife, or exhaustion. The truth pressed in from every side, heavy and undeniable. Something was wrong with this place. Not dangerous in the way movies make things dangerous, no jump scares, no obvious threat, but wrong in a way that made your instincts curl inward like an animal bracing for a storm. The smell changed again. Stronger now. Sweet, almost. Rotting leaves mixed with something like burned sugar. It seeped through the vents even though they were closed, clinging to the back of my throat. The voice-like sound shifted, sliding closer to something recognizable. I heard my name, not shouted, not whispered, just stated. Flat. Curious. I hadn't told anyone I was coming out here. That was the moment denial finally cracked. My hands shook as I reached for the keys, the engine turning over with a reluctant groan that felt personal, like the RV itself didn't want to leave. The headlights flared, cutting through the trees, and for a split second, they illuminated something standing at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't fully there, more like a suggestion of form. Too tall, too still. The light passed over it and it dissolved back into shadow, but the impression burned into my eyes. The knocking stopped. The forest exhaled. I shifted into drive, tires spinning in the mud, and as the RV lurched forward, I caught one last glimpse in the side mirror of the empty campsite filling in behind me, tracks smoothing over, impressions fading, as if the ground itself was erasing evidence. As I reached the road, my GPS recalculated. The other RVs were gone, not moved. Gone. And deep down, beneath the fear and the adrenaline, a colder realization settled in. Whatever had been out there didn't chase me. It had let me go. The road out of the campground felt longer than it should have, stretching under my headlights like it was resisting me. And even when the trees finally thinned and the forest road connected back to pavement, I didn't slow down. I didn't breathe right again until I'd driven nearly 40 minutes south, far enough that the silence inside the RV broke into something more familiar. Engine hum, tire noise, the faint rattle of loose screws I kept meaning to tighten. I pulled over at a closed gas station, lights off, and sat there with my forehead resting against the steering wheel. My hands smelled like cold metal and old coffee. My heart was still racing, but underneath it was something worse. Confusion that refused to settle into logic. I replayed the night frame by frame, looking for the crack where fear had slipped in. Fatigue. Late arrival. Cold air playing tricks. I told myself all the things I'd always told myself. That's how I survived the divorce, by narrating events until they sounded reasonable enough to live with. But the images wouldn't soften. The tire tracks that stopped. The footprints that didn't leave. The voice that knew my name. I slept in the RV that night with the engine cold and the windows cracked just enough to keep them from fogging. I woke up every hour convinced I heard knocking that turned out to be my own heartbeat in my ears. By morning, the forest looked ordinary again. Texas sun filtering through branches, birds returning to their jobs like nothing had happened. I should have driven home. Instead, I did something I still don't fully understand. I went back. Not to the campground itself, not right away, but to a ranger station near the north edge of Sam Houston National Forest. The building was old, squat, painted a shade of green that tried and failed to blend in. A man in his late 50s sat behind the counter, flipping through paperwork with the detached patience of someone who'd seen every version of human anxiety pass through his door. I told him my name, said I'd camped near one of the smaller sites off the forest road the night before. I mentioned the GPS glitch, the empty campground. I didn't mention the knocking. His pen stopped moving. "What site?" he asked, not looking up. I told him. That's when he finally raised his head. His expression didn't change much. No shock, no alarm, but something in his eyes closed off, like a door quietly locked. He leaned back in his chair, studying me the way you study someone who's stepped too close to a boundary without realizing it. "You sure about the date?" he asked. "February 22nd, I said, around 10 at night. He nodded slowly. "And your GPS showed other rigs there?" "Yes." He exhaled through his nose, almost a sigh. "You didn't stay, did you?" I hesitated. "No." "Good." The word landed heavier than it should have. He stood, walked to a bulletin board behind him, and pulled down a laminated map. He traced a finger along a familiar stretch of road, then stopped just short of the site I'd described. "That campground," he said, "was officially closed in 2019. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. It wasn't blocked off. No signs. "That's not unusual," he replied. "Storms take signs. People move barricades." "What about the tire tracks?" He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "People still go out there, but they don't always come back the way they went in." Silence settled between us, thick and uncomfortable. I waited for him to laugh, to tell me I'd misread things. He didn't. "Look," he continued, voice lower now, "this forest's bigger than folks realize. Older, too. Parts of it don't behave the way the maps say they should." "Like what?" I asked. He folded the map and put it away. "Like places that don't like being watched or measured or remembered." That should have been my cue to leave, to thank him and walk out and never turn my RV toward that part of the forest again. Instead, I asked the wrong question. "Have people disappeared out there?" His jaw tightened. "Officially? No." "And unofficially?" He met my eyes. Enough that we stopped keeping track. I drove away with that sentence echoing in my head, bouncing off old memories I'd spent years trying not to examine. Nights after the divorce, when the house felt too quiet, when familiar rooms felt hostile, like they were waiting for me to leave so they could rearrange themselves. That same feeling had wrapped around me in the campground, like the land itself wanted me gone, but didn't want to explain why. I told myself I was done. I wasn't. 2 nights later, I parked my RV along the same forest road, farther back this time, where the trees crowded close and the ground sloped unevenly. I justified it as closure, curiosity. Anything but what it really was, a need to prove that the fear hadn't changed me. I left the RV just after sunset with a flashlight, a camera, and a knot in my stomach that tightened with every step. The air was warmer than before, almost humid, carrying the smell of pine sap and something faintly sweet underneath. The forest felt alert, like it recognized me. As I approached the clearing, my ears popped suddenly, pressure shifting like I'd changed altitude. The sounds of insects faded again, not all at once, but in layers. One species dropping out, then another, until only my footsteps remained. The campground looked different, not empty, incomplete. The ground was uneven in places where it hadn't been before, rising and dipping in subtle waves. The fire rings were there, but warped, metal bent as if exposed to heat far beyond any campfire. One picnic table stood upright, its surface scarred with deep gouges that looked almost like letters if you stared too long. I raised the camera and took a photo. The screen flickered, then showed something that made my stomach lurch. The image displayed RVs, 3 of them, parked exactly where the GPS had shown them. But when I lowered the camera, the clearing was still empty. I took another photo. Same result. Another. Same. The smell intensified, sweet and rotten now, thick enough to taste. My flashlight beam wavered, not from my hand shaking, but like the air itself was bending it. That's when the voices started. Not one, many, layered over each other, overlapping, all trying to speak at once, but never quite syncing up. Some sounded close, others distant. One of them sounded like my ex-wife, calling my name the way she used to when she was tired but still hopeful. "Evan," it said, "you left too early." My chest tightened, grief and fear tangling together until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. That was the real trap, not the forest, not the campground, but the way it reached into the places I'd left unresolved, offering familiarity like bait. The ground shifted under my feet. Not an earthquake, not movement. More like settling. I stumbled backward as the earth dipped where I'd been standing, a shallow depression forming, soft mud swallowing my boot halfway to the ankle. I yanked my foot free and ran. Behind me, the knocking returned, but now it was everywhere. On trees, on metal, on the inside of my skull. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. I didn't stop running until I hit the road, lungs burning, heart pounding so hard it blurred my vision. I didn't look back. When I reached the RV, I locked myself inside and drove without headlights for the first mile, afraid to illuminate anything that might be waiting just beyond the beam. I never camped in Sam Houston National Forest again. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm parked somewhere quiet and the world feels too still, my GPS will flicker. And for just a second, it shows other RVs nearby. After that second night, I stopped pretending the forest was finished with me. I drove south, then west, putting states between myself and Sam Houston, but distance didn't thin the memory the way I'd hoped. It sharpened it. The farther I went, the clearer everything became. The warped fire rings, the way the ground had behaved like something tired of being stepped on, the voices that knew exactly which wounds to touch. I told myself I'd imagined parts of it. That trauma has a way of editing reality. But the GPS didn't stop flickering. It happened first outside a small town in New Mexico. I was parked at a legitimate campground this time. Check-in kiosk, electric hookups, families laughing 2 sites down. Safe. Normal. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it. A faint, hollow knock. 3 beats. I froze, toothbrush dripping foam into the sink. I waited. Listened. Nothing. I laughed at myself, finished up, and checked my phone before bed. The GPS app was open, even though I hadn't touched it. The screen showed nearby RVs. 4 of them. Closer than they should have been. I stepped outside. The campground was exactly as it had been. Open spaces, flickering lanterns, the low murmur of voices. But beyond the edge of the maintained sites where the dirt faded into scrubland, I saw impressions in the soil. Tire tracks that pressed deep then ended. No exit. That was the night I understood this wasn't about a place. It was about leaving. I started sleeping with the lights on, started keeping the engine key within reach. I avoided isolated spots, chose crowded campgrounds, rest stops, even Walmart parking lots. It didn't matter. The smell would come back sometimes, sweet rot, burned sugar. And when it did, the air inside the RV felt thicker, harder to breathe, like the space was shrinking around me. I didn't tell anyone. How could I? The ranger's words echoed in my head, places that don't like being remembered. Talking about it felt dangerous, like I was keeping something alive just by giving it language. One night in Arizona, weeks later, the knocking came from inside the RV. Not on the walls, not outside, inside the cabinets. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. I stood there in the dim light, heart trying to claw its way out of my chest, staring at the pantry door. I thought about opening it, about confronting whatever was testing me. But something deeper than courage stopped me, an instinct older than pride. Don't acknowledge it. That's when the real lesson finally surfaced, heavy and undeniable. The campground hadn't vanished. It had finished with the people who stayed. I realized then that every time I lingered, every time I tried to understand it, document it, make sense of it, I was inviting it to finish with me too. The forest hadn't chased me because it didn't need to. It waited, patient, confident. It knew people like me always circle back, driven by the need to resolve what can't be resolved. So I changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, I stopped chasing solitude like it was a cure-all. I stopped camping in places that felt wrong just because they were quiet. I listened when my body reacted before my mind did. When the air felt heavy, I left. When the silence felt staged, I didn't ask why. I packed up. The knocking faded. The GPS glitches stopped. Months passed. Then in late summer, I received an email from a stranger. No subject line, just a few sentences. Saw your old Volkswagen out near Sam Houston back in 2022. You left early. Smart move. Most don't. The campground's open again, by the way. Always is if you know where to look. There was no signature, no reply address. I deleted it without responding, but the weight of it stayed with me because I knew something that email didn't say outright, that the campground was never really closed. It just changed who it allowed to leave. Sometimes when I think back on that night at 9:47 p.m., I realize the most frightening part wasn't the voices or the tracks or the way the land seemed to breathe. It was how easily I almost stayed, how familiar the fear felt, how close I came to accepting the invitation. That's the truth most people don't want to hear. Places like that don't prey on the reckless. They wait for the tired, the lonely, the ones carrying unfinished grief who mistake silence for healing. If you're out there in your RV, parked somewhere remote, and the world suddenly feels too still, if your GPS tells you you're not alone, but your eyes say otherwise, trust what your body knows before your pride argues back. Some campgrounds don't vanish, they remember, and once they do, they wait for you to decide whether you're leaving or whether you're finally staying. I thought deleting the email would be enough. That was the lie I needed at the time, that ignoring it would collapse whatever thread still connected me to Sam Houston National Forest. I kept driving, kept choosing crowded places, kept telling myself that awareness was the same thing as immunity. For a while, it almost worked. Weeks went by without the knocking, without the smell, without that sensation of being quietly appraised by the dark. Then autumn arrived. There's something about fall that strips things down too honestly. Leaves die without drama. Air sharpens. Night comes earlier, with less apology. I found myself missing the road I used to take, the one that led me deeper into quiet instead of away from it. Missing isn't the same as wanting, but it's close enough to be dangerous. I was in Louisiana when the dreams started. Not nightmares. Not exactly. I'd dream of parking my Volkswagen at a campground I couldn't fully see. The details never held still. Sometimes it was pine forest, sometimes scrubland, sometimes somewhere that felt older than trees. But every time the same thing happened, I'd step out of the RV and the ground would be warm under my feet. Not sun-warmed, body-warmed, like something had just been there. I'd wake up before the knocking started, heart racing, sheets damp with sweat, convinced for half a second that I hadn't really woken up at all. One night, I checked my GPS out of habit. It was open. It showed a campground nearby I didn't recognize. No name, no photos, just a familiar cluster of RV icons arranged in a loose arc. My chest tightened. I zoomed in. The location marker hovered just off a forest road I knew, one I'd driven past dozens of times and never noticed. I told myself it was coincidence, that apps generate phantom locations all the time. But my hands shook as I set the phone down, face first, like it could see me watching. That night, the smell came back. Faint, almost polite. By morning, I knew the truth I'd been avoiding. The campground didn't want me back because I'd escaped. It wanted me back because I'd changed. I drove for hours without music, letting the hum of the road settle my thoughts into something honest. I realized then that what haunted me wasn't fear anymore. It was unfinished business. The place hadn't taken anything from me, not really. It had shown me something about myself I hadn't wanted to see, how willing I'd been to disappear, how tempting it had felt to stay somewhere that asked nothing of me but presence. That's the part no one talks about. Horror isn't always about being chased. Sometimes it's about being offered rest in a way that feels permanent. I didn't plan to go back, but when the forest road appeared in front of me, unmarked, unassuming, I didn't turn away either. The sky was already darkening when I parked. No rush this time, no denial, just a heavy, steady resolve that felt more like grief than courage. I left the engine running, headlights cutting into the trees, and stepped out into air that smelled exactly like memory. The silence welcomed me, not warmly, but knowingly. I walked only a few steps past the edge of the road, far enough to feel the ground soften beneath my boots. Far enough to hear the first knock echo somewhere behind the trees. 3 beats. Pause. 3 beats. "I didn't come to stay," I said aloud. My voice didn't shake. The forest responded the only way it ever had, by leaning closer. The temperature shifted. The air thickened. I felt that familiar pressure in my ears, that sense of something aligning itself just out of view. I understood then what the ranger had meant. Places like this don't trap people physically. They trap them emotionally. They reflect back whatever you're carrying until you can't tell where you end and the place begins. "I know why you let me leave," I said, heart pounding now, but steady, "and I know why you keep calling." The knocking stopped. In the quiet that followed, I felt something like attention focus on me. Not hostile, not kind. Curious. I thought about the night I'd first arrived, about how close I'd come to staying, about how loneliness had made danger feel like company. "I don't need to disappear anymore," I said, "and I don't need you to hold what I couldn't." The forest exhaled. Not wind, release. The smell faded, the pressure lifted. Somewhere deep among the trees, something shifted, not moving toward me, but settling back into itself. I walked back to the RV and shut the door. The engine idled steadily, patient. When I pulled onto the road, the GPS recalculated once and only once before clearing completely. No nearby RVs, no phantom campground, just a road leading forward. I didn't look back. I haven't been followed since, but I think about that place often, not with fear, but with respect. It taught me something brutal and necessary. That solitude isn't the same as isolation. That silence can heal, but it can also erase. And that some places don't want to hurt you, they want to keep you exactly as you are when you arrive. If you're listening to this somewhere quiet, somewhere remote, understand this. The most dangerous thing a campground can offer isn't terror, it's relief. And if the quiet ever starts to feel like it's asking you to stay forever, don't argue with your instincts. Don't romanticize the stillness. Pack up, turn the key, leave while the road still remembers you. Because some campgrounds don't vanish when you leave. They wait to see if you've learned enough to never come back. The first thing that felt wrong wasn't the sound, it was the silence that wrapped around it, like the forest was holding its breath just for me. My name is Ethan Caldwell. I was 39 years old that fall, old enough to trust my routines, stubborn enough to doubt my instincts. I had been RV camping across the southern United States for over a decade by then, mostly solo, sometimes to clear my head, sometimes because I didn't know how to be still anywhere else. November of 2016 found me deep inside Davy Crockett National Forest, parked off a primitive campground road that barely deserved the name. No hookups, no ranger station nearby, just a gravel clearing, a fire ring made of uneven stones, and trees packed so tight they swallowed the sky. I liked places like that, places that didn't pretend to be friendly. The forest smelled damp and metallic that night, like wet leaves and old iron. The temperature had dropped fast after sunset, one of those Texas cold snaps that feels sharper because you don't expect it. My breath fogged the air every time I stepped outside the RV, and the ground crunched faintly under my boots, frozen just enough to complain. I remember checking my watch when the fire finally settled into a steady burn, 11:31 p.m. I remember it because I almost went inside then. Almost. But the firelight felt like a small, stubborn island, and I wasn't ready to give it up yet. I'd driven 6 hours that day, longer than planned. I told myself I was tired, that the unease curling in my stomach was just exhaustion. That's what I always told myself. I had learned, over years of solo camping, how easy it was to talk myself out of fear when fear was inconvenient. The forest around me was alive with sound at first. Wind sliding through branches, the dry hiss of leaves scraping together, Somewhere far off, an owl called once, short, clipped, final, normal sounds, familiar sounds. Then slowly, those sounds thinned. It didn't happen all at once. It was more like a dimmer switch turning down. The wind softened. The leaves stopped moving. Even the insects, whatever few were still active in November, went quiet. I didn't notice immediately. I was stirring a dented tin mug of coffee that had long since gone cold, staring into the fire, letting my thoughts wander places I didn't usually let them go. That's when I realized how loud my own breathing sounded. I paused, spoon hovering over the mug, and listened. The silence pressed in close, thick enough that my ears rang. It felt wrong in a way that's hard to explain unless you've been alone in the woods long enough to know what normal quiet sounds like. This wasn't that. This was deliberate. I stood up slowly, the chair creaking louder than it should have, and scanned the tree line. The firelight only reached so far, painting the nearest trunks in flickering orange before surrendering them to shadow. Beyond that boundary, the forest wasn't black, it was layered. Depth on depth. A wall of vertical lines and negative space that made my eyes work too hard. I told myself it was just the cold playing tricks on me, just my imagination filling gaps the firelight couldn't reach. Then I smelled something that didn't belong. It was faint at first, like a dirty blanket left out in the rain. Damp, sour, edged with something animal. I sniffed again, turning my head slightly. The smell wasn't coming from the fire or the RV. It drifted in from the right side of the clearing, from a stand of trees so dense they looked knotted together. I felt a prickle of irritation more than fear. Animals wandered close to camps all the time. Deer, feral hogs, the occasional curious raccoon. I dealt with all of them. I told myself that was all this was. Still, I reached for the flashlight clipped to my belt. The beam cut through the firelight and stabbed into the trees. Leaves flashed white, then green, then disappeared again. Trunks leapt forward and fell back as I moved the light, searching for eyeshine. I expected to see the low, cautious glow of an animal watching from cover. I saw nothing. The smell lingered, stronger now, thick enough to coat the back of my throat. I lowered the flashlight and listened again. The silence hadn't broken. If anything, it felt heavier, like the forest was leaning inward. I laughed once, short and sharp, half more to hear a human sound than because anything was funny. "Get a grip," I muttered. The word sounded small. I sat back down, closer to the fire this time, and fed it another log. The flames flared, throwing sparks upward. For a moment, the world shrank back to the circle of light and heat. My shoulders loosened. My heart slowed. That's when I heard the first step. It wasn't loud. It wasn't sudden. Just the unmistakable sound of weight settling onto leaf-littered ground, slow and careful, from somewhere beyond the edge of the light. I froze, hands still resting on the log I just placed. Every nerve in my body went tight, like a wire pulled too far. I waited for a follow-up sound, a shuffle, a snort, anything that would fit into a category my brain knew how to handle. Nothing came. Seconds stretched. The fire popped softly. My pulse thudded in my ears. I told myself I'd imagined it, that my mind, already primed by silence and smell, had invented a sound to match the mood. Then I heard it again. Another step, closer this time, deliberate, heavy enough to compress leaves, slow enough to suggest control. Whatever it wasn't wandering, it wasn't spooked, it was approaching. I stood, heart hammering now, and swung the flashlight back toward the trees. The beam shook despite my grip. I forced myself to steady it, sweeping the light back and forth, widening the arc. The firelight ended. The flashlight beam took over, and just beyond where the two lights overlapped, right at the seam between orange and white, I saw movement. Not a shape, not a body, just a subtle shift, like something tall had leaned back just far enough to stay hidden. Leaves rustled, soft and brief. My mouth went dry. "Hey," I called out, my voice cracking despite my effort. "You okay out there?" The question felt stupid the moment it left my mouth. Who was I talking to? Another camper? No one else had been at the trailhead. I was sure of it. I'd checked twice. No answer came back. The smell surged again, stronger than before, carrying a warmth that didn't match the cold air. I gagged, fighting the urge to cough. My instincts, those old, quiet alarms I'd learned to ignore, were screaming now, every one of them. I took a step backward toward the RV. That's when the thing beyond the firelight shifted again. This time, I saw enough to know I didn't want to see any more. Something stood just outside the reach of the flames. Upright. Too upright. It didn't move like an animal testing the air or a person stepping into view. It simply adjusted, as if it had been standing there all along, waiting for me to notice. The fire popped loudly, throwing a burst of sparks, and for a fraction of a second, the light caught what looked like the suggestion of a shoulder. Or maybe a branch shaped too much like one. I couldn't tell. And that terrified me more than certainty ever could. My heart slammed so hard it made me dizzy. I backed up again, boots scraping gravel, never taking my eyes off that dark seam between light and shadow. Every rational explanation I'd leaned on cracked at once. This wasn't curiosity. This wasn't coincidence. This was attention. And it was focused entirely on me. I reached the RV door, fingers fumbling for the handle, when I heard a sound that finally broke the paralysis holding me in place. A slow, controlled exhale from the darkness. Not a growl, not a snort, a breath. Close enough that I could feel it slide across the firelight, stirring the flames. That's when panic took hold. Not loud, not wild, but cold and absolute. The kind that narrows your world to a single decision: stay or run. I yanked the RV door open and stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me hard enough to rattle the cabinets. The lock clicked into place with a sound that felt pathetically small. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old upholstery. Safe smells, human smells. I leaned my forehead against the door, gasping, trying to slow my breathing. Outside, the fire crackled, and something moved just beyond it. I stayed pressed against the door longer than I care to admit, listening to my own breath rasp in and out like it didn't belong to me anymore. The RV felt suddenly fragile. Thin aluminum skin, hollow walls, glass windows that seemed too large now. Every sound inside echoed too loudly. The ticking of the cooling engine, the faint hum of the fridge, the soft creak as the frame settled into the cold. Outside, the fire snapped again. I forced myself to move. Slowly. Any sudden noise felt like an invitation. I reached up and twisted off the interior light, plunging the RV into darkness. The windows became mirrors for a second, reflecting my own pale face back at me. Eyes wide, jaw clenched, a stranger staring out from behind the glass. I stepped away so I wouldn't have to see myself. The smell found its way inside next. It slipped through unseen gaps, through vents I'd never worried about before. Damp. Sour. Alive. I covered my nose with my sleeve, fighting the rising nausea, and edged toward the front window. Inch by inch, I lifted the curtain just enough to peer out. The fire was still burning, but lower now, the flames bending strangely, like they were being pushed by something I couldn't see. Shadows twisted and stretched across the clearing, reaching farther than they should have. The tree line stood unmoving, black columns against darker space. I scanned for motion. At first, there was nothing. Then the firelight flickered, and a shadow crossed it. Tall, narrow, too smooth in its movement to be branches or smoke. It slid across the ground just beyond the flames, interrupting the light in a way that made my stomach drop. Whatever cast that shadow wasn't pacing or circling. It was repositioning. My throat tightened. I lowered the curtain and backed away. Heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I wanted to believe the RV door was a barrier. I wanted to believe locks mattered. A soft sound reached me through the wall, not a knock, a touch. Something brushed along the exterior of the RV, slow and exploratory. I could hear it clearly now, leaves crunching under shifting weight, fabric or skin dragging lightly across metal. The sound traveled from the rear corner toward the side window, unhurried, intimate. I clenched my fists, nails biting into my palms. Every instinct screamed to stay still, to become small, to pretend I wasn't there. At the same time, another part of me, the stubborn, prideful part that had kept me camping alone for years, whispered that this was ridiculous. That fear was making a monster out of nothing. That whisper died when the breathing started again. It came from just outside the wall, deep and measured. Each inhale followed by a pause that felt intentional. I could almost picture it standing there, head tilted, listening to the sounds I couldn't stop making. My heart betrayed me with every beat. "No," I whispered, though I didn't know who I was speaking to. "No, no." The breathing stopped. For one brief, awful moment, hope flared. Maybe it was gone. Maybe it had lost interest. Maybe. A sudden, sharp tap hit the side of the RV. I flinched so hard I stumbled backward into the dinette. The tap came again, higher this time, near the window. Not forceful, not violent, just precise. Testing. Then a slow drag, nails or something like them scraping lightly along the aluminum siding. The sound crawled under my skin, deliberate and patient, like it had all the time in the world. I snapped. I lunged forward and slammed the curtain shut fully, plunging that side of the RV into total darkness. My breath came in ragged gasps now, panic finally clawing its way free. I knew, with a clarity that scared me, that staying put wasn't an option anymore. I needed to leave. The problem was, leaving meant stepping back into the open. It meant breaking whatever fragile boundary the RV provided. I glanced toward the driver's seat, then toward the back, weighing options that all felt impossible. The engine was cold. Starting it would be loud. Bright headlights would slice through the dark like a signal flare. I stood there, paralyzed by the math of fear, when something new happened. The smell changed. It grew warmer, stronger, and closer. I felt it before I heard anything, a subtle shift in pressure, like the air itself was leaning in. Then came the sound of weight against the RV, not a shove, but a lean. The frame groaned softly in protest. I bit down on a shout. The breathing returned right outside the wall behind my head now. Slow, curious. A wet sound threaded through it like lips parting. That was it. I moved on, pure instinct. I lunged for the driver's seat, fumbling for the keys, pad, hands shaking so badly I dropped them once, twice, before finally jamming them into the ignition. The engine coughed, protested, then roared to life far louder than I'd hoped. Outside, something reacted. I heard movement, fast this time, leaves scattering. A sharp exhale, suddenly close to the front of the RV. I slammed the headlights on, the beams cutting through the clearing in twin white spears. For a split second, the light caught something standing near the fire pit. I didn't see a face. I didn't see eyes. I saw height, shoulders that sat too high, a body that seemed wrong in proportion, stretched upward like it didn't quite belong to the ground it stood on. The light hit it, and it recoiled. Not away, but sideways, slipping back into shadow with a speed that didn't match its size. I screamed then, a raw, wordless sound, and threw the RV into gear. Gravel sprayed as I lurched forward, tires spinning before catching. The RV surged down the narrow road, branches scraping both sides, mirrors clipping unseen obstacles. I didn't slow down. The forest closed in around me, headlights carving a frantic tunnel through trees that leaned too close. My hands ached from gripping the wheel. Every shadow looked like pursuit. Every bend in the road felt like a trap. I kept expecting to see it step into the beam ahead of me. Kept expecting the road to end, but it didn't. Minutes later, though it felt like hours, the trees thinned and the road widened just enough for me to breathe again. I didn't stop until I reached a paved highway, the yellow lines glowing like salvation beneath my headlights. I pulled over then, chest heaving, and killed the engine. Silence rushed back in, but this time it was different. Hollow. Aftershock silence. I sat there until my hands stopped shaking. I never went back for that campsite. I never camped alone in Davy Crockett National Forest again. And I learned something that night, something I carry with me every time I park an RV and light a fire. The wilderness doesn't always announce itself when it wants your attention. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it stands just beyond the firelight, patient and quiet, until you make the mistake of believing you're alone. And the next time you feel the forest go still, don't argue with that feeling. Leave. I thought getting onto the highway meant it was over. That's what I told myself as the miles rolled under my tires and the forest dissolved into darkness behind me. I drove for nearly an hour before I trusted my hands enough to loosen my grip on the wheel. Even then, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see something tall and impossible pacing me just beyond the reach of my taillights. I pulled into a truck stop just before 2 in the morning. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and unforgiving, washing everything in a sickly white glow. I parked between two semis with their engines idling, the vibrations steady and grounding. Human noise, diesel fumes, coffee and oil and hot brakes, the normal world, loud and indifferent. I slept in short, broken fragments that night. Every time I drifted off, I dreamed of the fire dying down, of shadows stretching longer than they should. I woke with my heart racing, convinced I could still smell that damp animal warmth lingering in the RV. By morning, I told myself a different story. I told myself it had been a person, a vagrant, someone living rough in the woods who'd gotten too close, too curious. I told myself fear had filled in the blanks, stretched proportions, invented intention where there was none. I needed that explanation. I needed the world to make sense again. So I drove home. For weeks afterward, I avoided thinking about Davy Crockett National Forest. I cleaned the RV obsessively, scrubbing surfaces that didn't need it, airing it out like I could chase the memory away with disinfectant and fresh pine scent. I slept with the windows cracked, even when it got cold, because enclosed spaces made my chest tighten. The thing was, the forest didn't stay behind. It followed me in small ways at first. In sounds. A branch brushing the side of my house at night would snap me awake, heart hammering, breath shallow. The hum of my refrigerator would shift just enough in pitch to sound like breathing, and I'd stand there in the dark kitchen, listening far longer than made sense. I stopped camping for a while, told friends I was busy, told myself I was just taking a break. Months passed. Winter gave way to spring. Life smoothed itself out around the edges, as it always does. And slowly, almost without noticing, I began to doubt my own memory. That doubt was the most dangerous part. By late summer of the next year, the itch returned. The road, the quiet, the ritual of setting up camp, of being somewhere that didn't ask anything of me. I convinced myself that fear had exaggerated one bad night, that avoiding what I loved would only give it power. So I went back out, not to Davy Crockett, somewhere safer, busier. A state park with marked sites and posted rules, and a ranger station within shouting distance. The first night passed without incident. The second night, sitting by a modest fire under a sky washed thin with stars, I felt it again. That shift. The soundscape thinning out. The subtle pressure of being observed. My pulse spiked instantly, fear rising hot and fast this time, no denial left to slow it down. I stood, heart pounding, scanning the tree line, every muscle tight and ready to bolt. Nothing happened. The forest stayed quiet, but it didn't close in. No smell, no steps, no breathing. I packed up and left at dawn anyway. That's when I finally understood what had changed. It wasn't that the wilderness had become more dangerous. It was that I had learned to listen. The night in Davy Crockett had stripped something away from me. The comfortable illusion that solitude always meant safety, that experience alone could protect me from the unknown. I had spent years trusting my judgment because it had never failed me before. That night taught me that instincts aren't something you reason with after the fact. They're something you respect in the moment. I started camping differently after that. I stopped chasing isolation for its own sake. I paid attention to how places felt, not just how they looked on a map. I learned the normal rhythms of a campsite quickly, and the instant those rhythms broke, I took it seriously. Most importantly, I stopped arguing with fear. Fear isn't always a weakness. Sometimes it's the oldest sense we have, tuned to patterns we don't consciously recognize. Sometimes it notices when the forest goes still because something else has noticed you first. I still don't know what stood beyond my firelight that night. I don't need a name for it. Names make things feel smaller, manageable. Whatever it was, it didn't feel like a misunderstanding. It felt like a presence. And here's the truth I don't often say out loud. I don't think it chased me away because it was angry or hungry. I think it was curious. I think it was deciding. That thought stays with me more than any image ever could. because curiosity can return. Every time I sit by a campfire now, watching the flames push back the dark, I remember how fragile that boundary really is. How light doesn't conquer the night, it just negotiates with it. I keep my camps tight, my exits clear, my keys within reach, and when the woods fall silent in that specific way, when the air feels heavier, closer, when sound pulls inward instead of drifting away, I don't wait for proof anymore. I don't shine my flashlight and demand answers. I leave. Because some lessons don't come with closure. Some encounters aren't meant to be resolved, only survived. And the wilderness doesn't owe us understanding, only honesty, if we're quiet enough to hear it. That night in November taught me something I carry with me every mile I drive, every place I stop, every fire I light. We don't just visit the wild. Sometimes, for a brief moment, it notices us back. I didn't tell that story for a long time, not because I was afraid people wouldn't believe me, but because I was afraid they would try to explain it away. I learned quickly that once you give people something neat and rational, they stop listening to the parts that matter. They stop listening to the feeling. And the feeling is the truth. Years have passed since that night in Davy Crockett National Forest. I'm older now. Slower, maybe. Quieter in ways I wasn't before. I still travel by RV. I still chase long roads and wide skies. But I no longer treat the wilderness like a backdrop for my peace. I treat it like a presence with its own rules, its own patience, its own attention span. Because once you've felt what it's like to be noticed out there, really noticed, you don't forget it. People like to believe danger announces itself, that it crashes in, loud and obvious, teeth bared. But what I learned that night is that the most dangerous moments arrive softly. They arrive in pauses, in absences, in the way the night suddenly rearranges itself around you. They arrive when the forest goes quiet for no reason you can name. I've camped in places since then that were objectively more dangerous, steeper terrain, worse weather, rougher roads, but none of them unsettled me the way that clearing did. None of them pressed against my awareness like something leaning just out of sight, testing the limits of light. And that's the part I want people to understand. Whatever stood beyond my firelight didn't feel chaotic. It didn't feel lost or desperate. It felt measured, controlled, as if the rules of that place belonged to it, not me, as if I was the unfamiliar thing. That realization does something to you. It strips away the illusion that you're always the observer, that you're always the one watching nature from a safe distance. Sometimes the roles reverse and the wild doesn't rush you. It studies you. It waits to see what kind of creature you are. I think about that whenever I see other campers now. The ones who wander too far from their sight at night. The ones who ignore the way sound changes after dark. The ones who laugh off that tight feeling in their chest because it doesn't fit into a checklist or a guidebook. I want to stop them. I want to tell them that the woods don't need to roar to be dangerous, that silence can be a warning, that fear isn't always panic, it's sometimes clarity arriving early. But I usually say nothing, because some lessons only land when they come from experience. All I can do is share mine. If you take anything from this story, anything at all, let it be this. Don't romanticize isolation. Don't confuse solitude with safety. And don't assume that because you've camped 100 times without incident, the 101st will follow the same script. Pay attention to how a place feels, not just how it looks. Notice when the night pulls inward instead of expanding. Notice when the fire feels smaller than it should. Notice when your instincts speak quietly before fear ever has to shout. And if you ever find yourself sitting by a fire deep in the trees and you realize the forest has gone unnaturally still, if the air feels closer, heavier, like something is standing just beyond where the light can reach, don't wait. Don't investigate. Don't try to be brave. Pack up. Get in your RV. Leave while you still can. Because some things out there don't need to chase you. They only need you to stay. And the most dangerous mistake you can make in the wild is believing the darkness is empty just because you can't see what's standing in it. The first thing that woke me wasn't sound. It was movement, a subtle, impossible sway, like the ground itself had decided to breathe beneath my bed. My name is Elliot Moore. I was 38 that summer, and I had driven my old Volkswagen camper out to Caprock Canyon State Park because I needed silence more than I needed comfort. I'd grown up in Amarillo, not far from there, but life has a way of making familiar places feel distant once you've carried enough years on your back. I told myself I was camping to clear my head. That was the lie I used. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. I wanted to remember who I was before fear became a habit. The van had character, sun-faded paint, a door that stuck unless you leaned your shoulder into it, cabinets that sighed when you opened them. It smelled faintly of dust and old coffee grounds no matter how many times I cleaned it. That smell usually comforted me. That night, it felt stale, like a room that had been closed too long. I'd parked near the riverbed, a shallow, dry cut through the canyon floor that the ranger assured me was safe this time of year. June in Texas meant heat and cracked earth, not water. I remember nodding, pretending I hadn't already checked the forecast 3 times. No rain, clear skies, nothing to worry about. That confidence followed me into sleep. At first, the movement felt like a passing truck. The van rocked once, gently, then settled. I opened my eyes to darkness, the kind that presses close to your face. My ears strained, expecting the low growl of an engine fading down the road. Instead, there was a soft, continuous hiss, like breath being drawn through teeth. I lay still, listening. The hiss deepened, layered with a low rush, like a sound that didn't belong to wind or tires. It reminded me of something I'd heard once as a kid, standing too close to a swollen creek after a storm, water moving fast enough to carry secrets. But there hadn't been rain. I told myself it was my imagination, that the mind plays tricks when you wake too fast. Denial is a quiet thing. It doesn't shout. It whispers reasonable explanations and waits for you to accept them. The van shifted again. This time the cabinets rattled, glass clinking softly. My stomach tightened. I swung my legs down, bare feet touching the cool floor, and stood too quickly. The sensation hit me all at once, the cold. It wasn't the air. It was coming from below. I stepped toward the door and froze. The smell had changed. That dry, dusty comfort was gone, replaced by something sharp and alive. Wet stone. Mud. A metallic tang that coated the back of my tongue. I slid the side door open an inch. Water rushed past, close enough that I could see it even in the dark, moonlight breaking into jagged reflections on its surface. It wasn't a stream. It was a surge, fast and thick, carrying branches, clumps of earth, things that scraped and clattered as they passed. My heart began to pound, not with panic yet, but with disbelief. This wasn't possible. I leaned out farther, the cold air biting my skin. The riverbed, dry when I'd parked, was gone, swallowed by a moving body that pressed against the tires of my van like it knew they were there. The water climbed inch by inch, lapping at the rubber, testing its weight. That's when I heard the first impact. A dull, heavy thud against the rear wheel, strong enough to jolt the frame. The van rocked hard, throwing me back against the cabinet. I grabbed for balance, my fingers slipping on the smooth wood. Something had hit us. I slammed the door shut and stood there, breathing hard, my thoughts scattering. My mind raced through explanations, flash flood upstream, dam release, anything that fit into a world that still made sense. But another part of me, the one I'd learned to ignore over the years, whispered that this was different. The sound outside wasn't just water. There were patterns to it. Surges and lulls, impacts that came too heavy, too deliberate. The smell intensified, seeping through every crack, dampening the air until it felt thick enough to chew. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the van, trembling in my hand. Everything looked smaller in that artificial light, more fragile. The world I'd built inside those metal walls suddenly felt thin, temporary. Another Udar, this one closer to the front wheel. The van lurched, tires grinding against stone. I stumbled, catching myself on the counter, the realization crashing down on me all at once. I was in trouble. Panic tried to take hold, a hot rush that blurred my thoughts, but I fought it down. Panic wastes time. I'd learned that the hard way years earlier, in a different kind of dark. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to think in steps. Keys, phone, boots. The boots were by the door, damp with dew from earlier. I shoved my feet into them without socks, wincing as the cold bit into my skin. My phone had no signal. Of course it didn't. But I stuffed it into my pocket anyway, more for comfort than use. The keys trembled in my hand as I moved toward the driver's seat. That's when the van tilted sharply to the left. I crashed into the wall, the flashlight skittering across the floor and spinning, its beam slicing through chaos. Outside, the sound rose, a roar now, water slamming against metal with a force that vibrated through my bones. And beneath it all, something else. A scraping sound, slow and heavy, running along the underside of the van. Not debris tumbling freely, but something dragging, resisting the current just enough to make its presence known. My breath caught. My mind conjured shapes I didn't want to see. Trees uprooted miles upstream, fences, vehicles, anything but what my instincts suggested. The scraping stopped abruptly, replaced by a single, solid udar against the front axle that made the steering wheel jump. The van shifted again, this time settling at a new angle, one that told me the ground beneath it was no longer where it had been. I gripped the wheel and stared through the windshield, my flashlight beam catching flashes of water and darkness beyond. The headlights were useless without power, the engine silent, my escape reduced to a hope that flickered and dimmed. I thought about the ranger's easy smile, about the forecast, about all the times I'd ignored that quiet voice inside me because it was easier to trust the plan than the feeling. Outside, the water surged higher, brushing the bottom edge of the doors now, cold seeping in through unseen seams. The smell grew stronger, and with it a sense of being watched, not by eyes, but by the land itself, patient and indifferent. At 4:56 a.m., according to the dash clock that still glowed stubbornly red, the river rose without rain, and something big was still out there, moving just beyond the reach of my light, waiting for the next chance to strike. The van creaked like an old ship settling into unfamiliar water, metal complaining as pressure built from every side, and I realized with a sudden, awful clarity that the river wasn't just passing by, it was choosing me. I turned the key. Nothing, not even the courtesy click. The battery light glowed weakly, then dimmed as if embarrassed by the effort. Water slapped the side panel again, harder this time, and the van shuddered, drifting an inch before catching on something solid beneath it. That brief movement was enough to snap the last thread of denial. The ground I trusted was gone. I leaned my forehead against the steering wheel and listened. The soundscape had changed. The initial roar had deepened into a layered chaos, rushing water, grinding stone, the hollow clunk of debris colliding with unseen obstacles. But threaded through it all was a rhythm that didn't belong. A pulse. 3 surges close together, then a pause. Again, almost like footsteps translated into current. My flashlight lay where it had fallen, beam pinned against the cabinet, vibrating with every impact. I grabbed it and aimed it out the windshield, following the line of water as it curved around the front of the van. The river was higher now, swollen and opaque, carrying branches stripped bare, clods of red earth, things that looked almost intentional in the way they moved. Then the beam caught on something pale. It surfaced only for a second, long enough for my brain to register shape before instinct slammed the image away. Too smooth for a log, too wide. It rolled once in the current, bumping hard against the passenger side wheel, and the van lurched violently. I cried out. The sound ripped from my chest before I could stop it. The pale thing drifted off, swallowed again by dark water. I told myself it was livestock. Deer got caught in flash floods all the time. That explanation was a lifeline, flimsy but necessary. I clung to it even as another impact struck the undercarriage, this one accompanied by a deep, resonant knock that traveled up through the frame and into my ribs. The knock came again, 3 times, slow, deliberate. It was impossible, I knew that. Water doesn't knock, but the pattern was there, undeniable, and my skin prickled as a memory surfaced uninvited. Late nights in my childhood home, pipes ticking in the walls. My younger self convinced someone was tapping from inside the house, trapped, asking to be let out. I'd learned to ignore that fear, too. Learned to rationalize until the sound faded or I fell asleep. This time, it didn't fade. Cold water seeped in around the base of the door, pooling across the floor in thin, glistening sheets. It numbed my toes through the boots, a shock that anchored me back in my body. I had to move. Staying meant waiting for the river to decide it wanted more. I shoved the driver's door open against the current. The force of it nearly wrenched my arm from its socket, water surging inside like it had been invited. The smell hit me full on now. Mud, rot, and something sour beneath it, a scent that spoke of things disturbed after long burial. The water was already mid-calf outside, racing past so fast it blurred. I hesitated, heart hammering, calculating angles and speed the way I'd once calculated risks in another life. I knew flash floods. You don't fight them. You don't underestimate them. But I also knew staying in a vehicle could turn it into a coffin. Another Adar slammed into the rear harder than before. The van rocked, then slid a few inches, tires screeching against submerged stone. That decided it. I stepped out. The current grabbed me instantly, tugging at my legs, trying to fold me under. I gasped, the cold stealing my breath, and braced myself against the open door, knuckles whitening as I fought to stay upright. The water was alive with debris, things brushing past my calves, bumping into my shins with little jolts of pain that sent sparks up my spine. I edged forward, using the van as a shield, my eyes locked on the faint rise of ground I thought I remembered near the canyon wall. Each step was a negotiation: lift, place, pray. The noise was deafening now, the river roaring like it resented being contained, echoing off rock faces I couldn't see. Halfway around the front of the van, something wrapped around my ankle. I screamed, pure panic finally breaking free, and kicked hard, losing my footing as the current surged. I went down on one knee, icy water flooding my boot, my hands slapping blindly against the van's slick metal. The thing tightened for a split second. Pressure, undeniable, before slipping away, carried off downstream. I scrambled upright, shaking, my breath coming in ragged sobs I couldn't control. I didn't look down. I couldn't. Whatever had touched me belonged to the river now, and if I gave it a face, it would take more than just my footing. I reached the front bumper and paused, pressed flat against the hood as the van shuddered again. The knocks returned, closer now, echoing through the metal like a heartbeat gone wrong. I could feel them through my palms, each one a reminder that the river was still testing, still pushing. I forced myself onward. The ground rose gradually, blessedly, the current losing some of its grip as I stumbled toward the canyon wall. I clawed my way up onto a slick patch of stone, collapsing there, chest heaving, my body shaking so hard my teeth chattered. From that vantage point, I could see the van clearly for the first time. It sat crooked in the flow, water nearly up to the headlights now, debris piling against its upstream side like offerings. The flashlight beam flickered inside, casting erratic shapes against the windows. For a moment it looked occupied, like someone was moving around inside, pacing. I blinked hard, the image dissolving into nothing more than light and shadow. Then the van shifted. Slowly, almost gracefully, it rolled onto its side, the river claiming it with a final, metallic groan. Water surged over the roof, swallowing the glow of the dash clock, the cabinets, the life I'd packed into that small, stubborn space. The flashlight went dark. Silence rushed in to replace the noise, thick and absolute in my ears, broken only by the relentless sound of water continuing on its path as if nothing remarkable had happened. I sat there, soaked and shaking, staring at the spot where my van had been, the weight of it all settling into my bones. Loss hit me in waves. Not just for the vehicle, but for the illusion that I could control outcomes if I planned well enough, trusted the right people, ignored the wrong feelings. As dawn crept into the canyon, pale and indifferent, the river began to recede as quickly as it had come. By the time rangers reached me, drawn by debris downstream and a story that didn't quite add up, The ground was already reappearing, slick and scarred but solid again. They asked about rain, upstream storms, dam releases. There were none. When they found my van later, lodged against a bend miles away, they cataloged the damage with practiced detachment. One of them paused, frowning at a dent near the front axle, deep and rounded in a way that didn't match rocks or trees. "Big impact," he muttered. "Must have been something heavy." I didn't answer. That night, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, I lay awake listening to the river in the distance, its voice softer now, almost gentle. I thought about the knocks, about the pale shape in the water, about how close I'd come to becoming just another piece of debris. I learned something out there in Caprock Canyons, something I carry with me every time I camp now, every time I park and tell myself I'm safe. Nature doesn't warn you the way people do. It doesn't argue or explain. It presses quietly at first, waiting to see if you'll listen. And if you don't, it finds a way to make sure you never forget. They took me out of the canyon just after sunrise, the world washed clean in a way that felt dishonest, like the land was pretending nothing had happened. The sky was flawless blue. Birds moved through the air like they'd kept their appointment with morning. If not for the mud caked up my legs and the way my hands wouldn't stop shaking, I could have believed it myself. I rode in the ranger truck in silence, wrapped in that borrowed blanket, watching the canyon walls slide past the window. Every dip in the road made my stomach tight. Every shadow along the rock looked deeper than it should have been. Fear doesn't leave all at once. It settles in, rearranges the furniture, makes itself at home. They dropped me near the visitor center, offered coffee I couldn't drink, and questions I couldn't fully answer. Flash flood, they said again. Sudden release somewhere upstream. Rare, but not impossible. I nodded. Let them have their explanation. What I didn't tell them was how the water had felt, not just cold but intentional, how the knocks hadn't sounded random, how something had wrapped around my ankle with purpose, not the careless brush of debris. Those details didn't belong in a report. They belonged in the part of me that would never quite relax again. By noon, the riverbed was dry enough to walk across. I stood at its edge, staring down at cracked earth already beginning to harden in the sun, and felt a wave of anger rise up in my chest. Not at the park, not at the river, at myself. I'd trusted the absence of danger more than my own instincts, trusted forecasts, assurances, routines. I'd ignored the subtle warnings, the way the air had felt heavier when I parked, the faint unease that settled in my gut as the sun went down, the knowledge buried deep that dry riverbeds are never truly empty. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel on the edge of town. The room smelled like cleaner and old carpet, and the air conditioner rattled like it might give up at any moment. I lay on the bed fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the sounds over and over. The scrape beneath the van, the rhythmic knocks, the way the river had risen without rain. Sleep came in fragments. Every time I drifted off, I was back in the water, current pulling at my legs, something unseen tightening its grip. I woke drenched in sweat, heart racing, the silence of the room pressing in on me until I turned on the TV just to break it. In the days that followed, the story spread the way these things always do, softened at the edges, made safer with distance. Lucky escape, people said. Nature's unpredictable. Friends called it a wake-up call, a reminder to be careful. But that wasn't the lesson the canyon taught me. Weeks later, I went back. Not to the same spot. I wasn't that reckless, but close enough to hear the river again, to stand where the land dipped and twisted in familiar ways. I needed to face it on my terms, to prove to myself that fear didn't get the final say. The river was calm that afternoon, a thin ribbon winding through stone. I crouched near the bank and let my fingers trail through the water. It was cool, innocent enough, giving no sign of the violence it was capable of. That's when I noticed the smell, faint but unmistakable. Wet stone and metal carried on a breeze that shouldn't have reached me where I stood. My chest tightened, memories flooding back with sharp clarity. I pulled my hand from the water and stood quickly, scanning the area. The canyon was empty, no movement, no sound beyond the wind. I realized then that the fear I carried wasn't just about that night. It was about control, about the illusion that experience makes you immune, that familiarity equals safety. I'd camped for years, trusted my routines, dismissed the quiet voice that urged caution because it had been inconvenient. The river didn't punish me. It corrected me. Now, when I camp, I listen differently. I pay attention to the way sound travels at night, how smells shift when the air changes, how the ground feels beneath my feet. I park higher than necessary. I leave earlier than planned. I don't argue with unease anymore, because some warnings don't come as alarms. They come as whispers. Every once in a while, usually just before dawn, I still wake to the memory of movement, the sensation of the world tilting beneath me. In those moments, I lie still and breathe, reminding myself where I am, what I survived. I think about the river flowing quietly through Caprock Canyons, patient as ever, waiting, not for revenge, not for blood, just for the next person who mistakes silence for safety. And when I finally drift back to sleep, it's with a respect I didn't have before, a hard-earned understanding that the land doesn't need to chase you to be dangerous. Sometimes all it has to do is rise. The first thing that felt wrong wasn't the carving, it was the silence that followed after I read it. I remember standing there with my flashlight angled low, the beam sliding across the picnic table like water over stone, catching the raw, pale grooves of freshly cut letters. Do not stay after dark. The wood was still splintered. Sap hadn't dried yet. Whoever carved it hadn't done it weeks ago or even days. It had been recent, close enough that the smell of cut cedar still lingered in the cool air. My name's Ethan Caldwell. I was 36 that spring, living out of a refurbished Volkswagen camper van I'd named June, mostly because she rattled like an old soul but never quite let me down. I'd grown up in Texas, hill country especially. Those rolling limestone ridges, twisted oaks, and dry creek beds felt like home to me. Lost Maples State Natural Area wasn't unfamiliar. I'd camped there half a dozen times before. It was one of those places locals trusted. Too trusted, maybe. That night, the park felt withdrawn, like it was holding its breath. I told myself the carving was a prank. Some bored kid, some drunk hiker with a pocket knife and too much imagination. I said that out loud, actually, just to hear my own voice break the quiet. My words sounded thin, like they didn't belong there. The trees didn't echo them back. I swept my light around. Other campsites were scattered along the loop, but most were dark already. A couple RVs down the way had their shades pulled tight, no lantern glow, no campfire smoke. It was only 10:05 p.m., but the campground felt abandoned, like everyone else had agreed on something I'd missed. Earlier that evening, I'd asked the couple at the ranger station, middle-aged locals, whether the campground stayed busy in March. The woman smiled too quickly and said, "Depends how long folks stay." I hadn't thought much of it then. I wish I had. I traced the carving with my glove, feeling the roughness catch. It wasn't decorative, no shaky lines. Whoever did it pressed hard, deliberate, like they needed the words to last. And what unsettled me most wasn't the warning itself. It was that it wasn't signed. No joke lands without credit. No threat without ego. This was neither. Just instruction. I went back to June and locked the door. Inside, the van smelled like coffee grounds and old canvas, familiar enough to calm me. I brewed a cup on the small propane stove, the hiss loud in the enclosed space. Outside, the night pressed closer. The temperature dropped fast, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself, just creeps in through the seams. I tried to distract myself. Checked my map, scrolled through photos on my phone, even put on an old radio broadcast I like to sleep to. Static bled through between words, the signal fading in and out like it was being swallowed by the hills. Eventually, I shut it off. Silence felt safer than half-heard voices. That's when I noticed the smell. At first, I thought something was wrong with the stove. A sharp, metallic tang mixed with damp earth. Not smoke, not gas. It reminded me of cold iron and wet leaves, the scent you get when a storm's coming but hasn't arrived yet. I cracked a window. The smell got stronger. Outside, the wind moved through the maples, but not like wind usually does. It wasn't a rush or a whistle. It was uneven, stopping and starting, as if something tall and careful was passing between trunks, brushing leaves aside with intention. I watched shadows slide across the frosted glass of the van, stretching and thinning in ways that didn't quite match the branches I knew were there. I told myself it was just the trees. Hill country trees twist. They always have. Still, I didn't sleep. Sometime after midnight, my phone read 12:47. I heard the first knock. Not loud, not urgent, just a single measured tap against the side of the van. Knuckle on metal. Too controlled to be a branch. Too solid. I froze, breath shallow, every muscle locked. Lost Maples was known for wildlife, deer, raccoons, the occasional feral hog, but animals don't knock. They scratch, they scrape, they ram. This was polite. I waited. Counted to 10, nothing. Then another knock. Same spot, same pressure. I slid from the bench seat and pressed my ear to the wall. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud enough it felt like it might answer back. I didn't call out. I didn't move toward the door. I stayed still, hoping whatever it was would decide I wasn't worth the effort. A voice drifted through the thin metal. "Hey," it said softly. "Male. Close. You okay in there?" Relief washed over me so fast it almost made me dizzy. Of course, another camper, maybe someone needing help. I cursed myself for letting the carving get under my skin. I answered through the door. "Yeah, everything's fine." There was a pause, long enough to feel awkward. "You staying the night?" the voice asked. Something in the way he said it tightened my chest, not the words, the tone, like he already knew the answer and it mattered more than it should. "Yeah," I said. "Just one night." Another pause. I pictured a man standing inches from my door, hands in his pockets, head tilted, listening. "That's not a good idea," he said. The smell outside intensified, seeping through the cracks again. My stomach turned. "Why not?" I asked, though every instinct screamed at me not to push. No answer. I waited. My fingers hovered near the keys hanging by the dash. If I needed to start the engine, I could. If June didn't betray me. I risked a glance through the front windshield. My flashlight was still on the dash. I flicked it on, swept the beam across the picnic table, the fire ring, the trees beyond. No one was there. The smell vanished all at once like it had never existed. I didn't open the door. I didn't step outside. I sat there until dawn, replaying the voice in my head, the way it sounded less like a warning and more like a confirmation. And when the sun finally rose over Lost Maples, painting the hills in gold like it always did, I noticed something that made my hands shake worse than they had all night. There was a second carving on the picnic table. Fresh. Deeper. And this one was longer. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at the new carving as if it might rearrange itself into something less final if I gave it time. The morning light made it worse, not better. At night, fear has shadows to hide in. In daylight, everything stands exposed, undeniable. The letters were larger than the first warning, cut with a deeper hand, gouged so hard the wood around them had splintered outward like bone after an impact. "We tried to tell you." No signature, no symbol, just those 4 words, unevenly spaced, as if the person carving them had stopped more than once, either to listen or to think. I looked around the campground again. Birds were back now, tentative at first, then louder, as if testing whether it was safe to exist again. A breeze moved through the maples, carrying the clean smell of morning. Whatever metallic rot had lingered in the night air was gone. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made me feel late. I packed slower than usual, my movements stiff, deliberate. Every sound, the zipper of my bag, the clink of a mug against the counter, felt amplified, like I was announcing myself to something that preferred me quiet. I kept expecting to hear that knock again. It never came. Before leaving, I walked the loop toward the ranger station. I needed someone else to see the carving, to confirm I wasn't imagining things. The woman from the night before was there again, pouring coffee into a thermos behind the counter. When I mentioned the picnic table, her smile vanished so quickly it startled me. She didn't ask which campsite. She just nodded. "We'll take care of it," she said, already reaching for a clipboard. You heading out? Yes, I said. But has anything happened out there recently? She hesitated, just a fraction too long. Lost Maples is old land, she said finally. People forget that. Old places don't always like to be occupied after dark. That was all I got. I drove out of the park an hour later, telling myself the knot in my chest would loosen once the road opened up, once the trees thinned and the familiar sprawl of Texas highways returned. It didn't. The unease followed me, quiet but persistent, like a weight I couldn't set down. For weeks after, I avoided that part of the state, told friends I was chasing warmer weather, new views. The truth was simpler. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that voice again. You staying the night? I tried to rationalize it. Stress, sleep deprivation, a local messing with campers for a laugh. But rational explanations don't leave marks on wood overnight. They don't carve messages while you're locked inside your van, wide awake. By late summer, curiosity started to rot into something worse. Guilt, like I'd been warned about something real and chosen to run instead of understand it. I hated that feeling. I'd spent years on the road trusting my instincts, believing fear was something to listen to, not obey blindly. Running felt like failure. So in September, against my better judgment, I went back. This time, I didn't come alone. My younger brother Caleb joined me, 29, restless, skeptical in the way only someone who's never been truly scared can be. He laughed when I told him about the carvings, called it hill country folklore nonsense, said people project meaning onto silence because they can't stand emptiness. You didn't actually see anyone, he reminded me as we crossed into the park. Just heard a voice. Could have been echo, could have been wind. Wind doesn't knock, I said. Neither do ghosts, he replied. We arrived just before sunset, same loop. Different campsite, one closer to the creek this time, where the trees crowded tighter, their roots twisting above the ground like exposed veins. I didn't tell Caleb that. I didn't tell him anything that might plant unease before it had reason to grow. The picnic table was clean. No carvings, freshly sanded like someone had erased the past with effort instead of explanation. That unsettled me more than if the words had still been there. As darkness crept in, the temperature dropped again, sharper this time. The creek's murmur took on a strange rhythm, irregular, like it was syncing with something unseen moving along its banks. Caleb built a small fire, humming under his breath, confident, loud. I envied him. Then the smells returned. Not metallic this time, sweet and sour at once, like decay hidden beneath wildflowers. It clung to the air, thick enough I could taste it. Caleb wrinkled his nose. Something die out here? He asked. Probably, I said, though my hands had started to shake. The fire popped. A log shifted, collapsing inward. Sparks flew up, briefly illuminating the trees. For just a moment, less than a second, I thought I saw something standing between them, tall, still, watching. I blinked. It was gone. Caleb noticed my stare. You good? Yeah, I lied. Just tired. We turned in around 11. He took the tent. I stayed in June. I told myself splitting up was fine, normal even. But when the zipper of his tent closed, the campground felt suddenly wrong again, like a puzzle piece forced into the wrong place. I lay awake listening. The creek slowed. The insects went quiet one by one until the night felt hollowed out. Then came the footsteps. Slow, measured, not circling, approaching. I sat up, heart pounding, flashlight in hand. The steps stopped just outside the van. I waited for the knock. It didn't come. Instead, the voice returned. Still here, it said. Not a question this time. My mouth went dry. Who is this? I called out. Silence. I glanced at my phone. No signal. Of course, the smell intensified, seeping through the van like fog. My head swam. Panic edged closer, sharp and electric. Then I heard Caleb scream. Not a long scream, short, cut off, like someone had clamped a hand over his mouth. I threw the door open and ran toward the tent, flashlight beam bouncing wildly. The tent was intact, zipper closed. Caleb, I shouted, tearing it open. He was inside, sitting upright, eyes wide, breathing hard. Did you hear that? He asked. Hear what? He swallowed. Someone was whispering my name. Behind us, the trees creaked, branches shifting without wind. I didn't wait anymore. We packed in silence, hands clumsy, fear burning away skepticism with brutal efficiency. As we drove out, headlights cutting through the dark, I glanced at the rearview mirror. At the edge of the campground, just before the road curved away, something stood between the trees. It didn't follow. It didn't need to. Because carved into the wooden sign at the park exit, letters so deep they caught the light, were the same words I'd seen months before. Do not stay after dark. This time, I understood they weren't meant to scare us. They were meant to limit how much of it could reach us. We didn't speak for the first 20 miles. The road out of Lost Maples twisted through the hills, headlights carving tunnels through cedar and oak, the darkness pressing tight on both sides like it wanted to fold back over us once we passed. Caleb's hands were clenched on his knees, jaw locked so tight I could hear his teeth grind every time we hit a bump. I kept one eye on the road and one on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something pacing us just beyond the reach of the lights. Nothing followed. That was almost worse. When the park entrance finally disappeared behind a bend, my chest loosened just enough for breath to come back sharp and painful. I pulled over at a gas station that looked like it had been forgotten by time, one flickering fluorescent bulb, a vending machine humming like an insect. We stood there under the light, the night wide open around us, and only then did Caleb speak. It wasn't just a voice, he said quietly. It was close, like it was already inside my head. I nodded. There was nothing to argue with anymore. We didn't camp again that night. I drove until dawn, until the land flattened and the sky turned pale and ordinary, until fear dulled into exhaustion. By the time we stopped, Lost Maples felt unreal, like a dream that lost its grip once morning came. But dreams don't leave residue. In the weeks after, things started to surface, small at first. I'd wake in the middle of the night convinced I smelled that same sweet rot, only to find the air clean and still. Caleb stopped camping altogether. He said he just lost the taste for it, but I saw the way he flinched when someone knocked unexpectedly, how his eyes tracked shadows that didn't deserve attention. For me, the worst part was the sound. Every so often, usually when I was half asleep, I'd hear a single knock. Not loud, not urgent, just measured, patient. I sold June that winter. People assume that decision came from fear, but it didn't. Not entirely. It came from understanding. The road teaches you that not every place wants to be known, and not every warning is meant to protect you from danger. Some are meant to protect the danger from you, to keep it contained, limited, fed, just enough attention to stay where it belongs. I went back to Lost Maples one last time the following spring, alone, in daylight. No van, no intention of staying, just to see if the land would let me leave something behind. The picnic tables were new, fresh wood, no carvings. The ranger, a different one this time, told me the old tables had been removed after persistent vandalism. When I asked what kind, he shrugged. Same message, over and over. Folks don't listen. I walked the trail until the trees thickened and the creek came into view. The water moved normally now, bright and harmless. Birds sang without hesitation. The land wore its innocence well. Before I left, I took out my pocket knife. I didn't carve a warning. I carved a promise. Just 3 words, shallow enough to weather away, tucked beneath the edge of a bench where only someone looking for it would ever notice. I heard you. As I turned back toward the trailhead, a breeze moved through the maples, not uneven, not pressing, just wind, ordinary and free. For the first time in months, the silence felt empty again, not watchful. I don't camp after dark anymore, not because I'm afraid, but because I've learned the difference between fear and respect. Some places aren't haunted by what happened there. They're guarded by what still does. And if you ever find yourself in a campground where the night grows too quiet, where the warnings feel less like threats and more like instructions, listen. Not every knock is asking to be answered. If you'd like, I can continue by expanding this into another connected story in the same universe, or deepen the aftermath further with long-term psychological consequences.